The cave kept its own time, not the time of the surface world, which was organized by the movement of the sun across the sky and the changing quality of light that followed from that movement, which divided the day into morning and midday, and afternoon and evening and night, and gave each of those divisions its own character and its own tasks. The cave had none of that. The cave had the constant temperature and the constant darkness and the sound of the underground river moving through its channel, and beyond those three things, it had nothing that resembled the ordinary markers of time at all. Lark learned to keep her own time. She kept it by the candles measuring the day and how many she burned and when using them deliberately rather than constantly, because the supply was not infinite and the cave could not replace them when they ran out. She kept it by hunger and by sleep, by the rhythms her body maintained independent of light or season. She kept it by the work, which was the most reliable measure of all, because work that needed doing announced itself at intervals that did not depend on what the sky was doing above the hill. In the first days she explored. She did this systematically the way she had always done things that needed to be done thoroughly, taking each passage in turn, following it to its end, or its limit, marking her route on the walls with a piece of chalk she found in the wreckage of the Ketchum cabin's main room during her first foray to the surface. The chalk marks were small and inconspicuous. They were for her navigation and no one else's, and she made them with the economy of someone who understood that there was no need to make them larger than their purpose required. The cave was larger than the first hours had suggested. It extended into the hill in three main directions from the central chamber, each direction offering its own character and its own gifts. The passage to the north was the longest, dry, and constant in its temperature, the walls showing the accumulated work of water that had moved through it in some geological past before finding a different route. It ended in a wall of flowstone after perhaps 200 feet, but along its length it offered three natural alcoves of useful dimensions, sheltered from the river's moisture and stable in a way that made them good for storing things. The passage to the west opened into the formation chamber, which was the most extraordinary space in the system, and which she spent a full candle in on the third day, moving through it slowly, with the light held up at various angles to understand what the darkness contained. The formations were extraordinary by any measure. Columns of calcite had been building themselves from floor and ceiling simultaneously for periods of time that her mind could not fully process, growing at rates measurable in fractions of an inch per century, reaching toward each other with the patient certainty of things that do not experience impatience, because they have never been in a hurry and have never needed to be. They caught the candlelight and held it and returned it, changed the white of them, turning gold and amber in the flame, the shadows between them deep and absolute and alive with the movement of the light. She had grown up in the Ozarks. She had always understood in the abstract way of someone living over something that the hills were full of such spaces. Understanding it and standing in it were two entirely different things. The eastern passage, which she had to climb 12 feet of natural limestone staircase to reach, led eventually to the surface entrance that Idell had described, the opening on the eastern slope of the ridge, overgrown and low and invisible from the ordinary routes that people traveled near the old Ketchum homestead. She confirmed this on the fourth day, pushing through the dead brush that had established itself across the opening to stand in the thin winter light of the hillside, looking down the slope toward the abandoned buildings 200 yards below. The Ketchum homestead. She went to it on the fifth day in the late afternoon, when the light was going and the probability of another person on that side of the ridge was as low as it was likely to get. The cabin was the worst of the three structures, its north roof boards missing its floor, soft in the corner, where the weather had gotten in over 10 years of no one patching what needed patching. She did not plan to live in it. She was looking at it the way she looked at everything now, with the specific practical eye of someone assessing what was available and how it could be used. The barn was better. Sound roof, solid walls, the particular durability of construction done by people who kept animals and understood that the structure protecting those animals needed to hold against whatever the Ozark weather offered. She went through it with the candle and took an inventory of what it contained, which was considerable. Tools on the wall hooks, rope in organized coils, a mattock, an axe, two hoes with dried but functional handles, things that a family had put where things belonged and that had stayed there through 10 years of no one moving them. The root cellar was behind the barn, built into the hillside in the old way, dug deep and walled with mortared limestone and covered with a timber frame and earth. the door swollen in its frame but yielding when she put her shoulder to it with enough sustained force. The smell that came out when it opened was the smell of earth and old wood, and the particular mineral quality of preserved food that has been sealed in cool darkness for a long time. The stores were still there, not all of them. 10 years had taken a toll on the things that time and cold and rodents could affect. But the Ketchum family had put up provisions with the thoroughness of people who took winter seriously, and what remained of a decade-old surplus was still substantial. Sealed mason jars whose lids had held, dried beans and cloth-wrapped stores that the mice had not entirely penetrated, a crock of cured meat sealed under a solid inch of hardened fat that had done its work, dried corn in a barrel, salt. She made 4 trips between the root cellar and the cave's eastern entrance that first afternoon, carrying what she could each time, moving steadily on the hillside in the gray winter light, aware of the possibility of being seen and managing that awareness without allowing it to prevent necessary work. The ridge above blocked the sight line from the valley road. The overgrown state of the Ketchum property provided additional cover. She was as invisible as the situation permitted, and she worked with the time she had. The cave received everything she brought into it. She organized the stores in the northern alcove with the systematic care of someone who understands that organization is not a luxury in conditions of limited supply, but is itself a form of survival, that knowing what you have and where it is and in what quantity it exists is the foundation on which every subsequent decision rests. She stacked the mason jars by content and condition. She stored the dried goods on the highest available surface where moisture could not reach them. She hung the rope and the tools on projections of limestone that served as hooks. She built a fire pit on the western ledge of the main chamber, ringed with stones she carried from the passage floor. She tested the ventilation the first evening, the fire catching and the smoke rising to the ceiling, and finding the passages that led out of the chamber, the ventilation Idell had described, working exactly as she had described it, the smoke dispersing into the cave's upper reaches and finding its way to the surface through cracks and openings that Lark would spend months locating and mapping. She built a pallet on the ledge using materials salvaged from the Ketchum cabin, the dry goods she could not eat, and the cloth she found in an old trunk in the barn that had survived in serviceable condition. On the 10th day, she sat on the ledge by her fire and ate heated beans from a Ketchum jar and looked at the formation chamber entrance across the main chamber where the candlelight caught the edge of a calcite column and turned it to gold. And she thought about what she had done and what she was doing and what she intended to do. She was alive. She was warm. She was fed. She was alone in a cave in the Ozark Hills, and every person in the valley on the other side of the ridge believed she was dead. And this was exactly the situation she had chosen and the situation she needed. And there was nothing about it that was simple or comfortable, but simple and comfortable had not been the available options. The loneliness was the thing she had not fully calculated. She had understood it intellectually. She had known before she went into the river that the life on the other side would be solitary, that the necessary secrecy of her existence precluded the ordinary social texture of a life lived among people who know you. She had known this and had assessed it as an acceptable cost. The knowing and the experiencing were different in the way that understanding the cold from inside a warm cabin and standing in the cold are different, the same information delivered through completely different mediums. The first winter was the hardest, not because of hunger, which the stores managed adequately, and not because of cold, which the cave's constant temperature prevented in any serious form. The hardness was of a different kind, the specific hardness of silence that extends past the useful and into something else, something that has no practical name, but that every person who has been genuinely alone for a sustained period will recognize without needing the name explained. She talked to herself sometimes. Not the continuous narration of someone losing their grip on the line between internal and external. The deliberate talking of someone who understands that hearing a human voice, even one's own, serves a purpose that silence cannot serve, and that the cave's acoustic qualities have their own form of responsiveness, the way the stone returns sound differently in different chambers, the way a song sung in the formation chamber comes back changed, harmonized by the limestone itself into something more than the voice that made it. She sang songs her mother had taught her. Clara Caldwell had had a singing voice of the ordinary kind, useful rather than remarkable, and she had used it the way she used everything, without waste and without affectation, for the purpose it served. She had sung to Lark when Lark was small, and then she had taught Lark the songs because the songs were worth knowing and because the teaching of them was its own form of closeness. Lark had not sung any of them since her mother died. In the Puy in the winter, alone with the underground river and the darkness and the 55-degree constancy of a temperature that neither punished nor rewarded, she sang them. They came back from the limestone walls in the harmonized way of the formation chamber, and she let them do what they did, and she listened to what they became when the stone received them and returned them, and she understood in a way she had not understood before what her mother had been giving her when she gave her those songs. The second winter was easier, not because the loneliness was gone, because it was not gone and would not be entirely gone for the duration, but because the second winter had the quality of a familiar difficulty rather than a new one, because she had been through it once and understood what it was and knew how to work with it rather than against it. She had learned to fill the hours with work that was not strictly necessary, but that served the same purpose that unnecessary work has always served, which is the purpose of occupying the mind with something that makes a demand of it and thus prevents the mind from making demands of itself. She expanded the garden in the second spring. The first garden had been modest, planted in the cleared ground near the Ketchum barn in the pre-dawn and late evening hours, harvested with the care of someone who could not afford to waste what they grew, and who moved on the hillside with the deliberate inconspicuousness of a person who does not wish to be seen. The second garden was more ambitious. The cleared area doubled additional beds prepared with the guano from the formation chamber, mixed into the soil in the way she had worked out through the first summer, the specific richness of material that had been accumulating in the cave's upper reaches for centuries, providing the garden with a fertility that ordinary Ozark hillside soil did not possess. She was a ghost in the surface world, and she used this condition the way it could be used. Idelle came in February of the first year, appearing at the eastern entrance with a bag and the information that her coming communicated, before any word was spoken, the information that someone in the above-ground world had not forgotten that Lark Caldwell existed. She brought news. Fletcher had come back from Springfield on the Friday after the drowning to find Josephine's account of it waiting for him, assembled and ready, the story told with the specific completeness of someone who had prepared it in advance of the audience for it. He had gone to the river. Idelle described this, carefully choosing what to include and what to set aside, and Lark listened to the choosing as much as the content, and understood from the choosing that what was being set aside out of consideration rather than out of deception. He stood at the bank for a long time, Idelle said, looking at the footprints. He didn't speak that day, didn't speak for 2 days after. Lark said nothing. He held a service for you at the church, Idelle said. He was in the front pew. He held himself together throughout it, and then he went home, and Mabel was there with her sons, and that was that. That was that, Lark said. It was not an expression of grief, though grief was present in it. It was a statement about the mechanics of things, about how situations settled into their shapes when the initial disturbance of them was over, and the people in them had adjusted to the new arrangement. What about the land? Lark asked. Idelle's expression changed slightly, the change of someone moving from easier information to harder. She has Reuben working the south field, Idelle said. Told your father the boy needed the practice and the land needed tending. He accepted this. He accepted it, Idelle confirmed. He is not a man who fights well when he is grieving. Lark looked at the fire. She knew this about her father. She had watched it in the years after her mother died, the way grief had reorganized him, had moved his capacities into different arrangements, had made certain things difficult that were ordinarily accessible. Mabel had arrived during that reorganization and had established herself inside it, and by the time Fletcher had moved fully through his grief, the establishment was complete, and the cost of undoing it was higher than he was willing to pay. She told Idelle about the letter. She told her what it said and what it meant, and why she had kept it, and what she intended to do with it eventually when the conditions were right. Idelle listened to all of it. Keep it dry, she said when Lark finished. Keep it exactly where it is and keep it dry. I have, Lark said. I will. Idelle looked at her. You understand that the letter alone is not enough. I understand. A letter in a cave is not testimony. A woman standing in a room is testimony. You will need to be a woman standing in a room. I know, Lark said. I'm not ready to be that woman yet. There are things that need to happen first and things I need to become. She looked at the fire. But I will be. Idell looked at her for a moment with those winter sky eyes. She came again in spring and then in the summer, and then before the second winter set in, bringing what she brought each time: food she could not grow herself and news that she could not get any other way. Lark began keeping a record of the news, a ledger she made from paper she found in the Ketchum cabin, writing down what Idell reported, and when building a documented account of the situation on the other side of the ridge that grew more detailed with each visit. It was in this ledger that the first entry about what Mabel was doing with the land appeared. Idell had seen it at the county clerk's office, had gone there for another purpose, and had noticed the filing. A transfer of use rights to the South Field from Fletcher Caldwell to one Reuben Pruitt, effective as of that date. Witnessed and recorded in the proper legal form. Use rights, Lark said. Not ownership, Idell confirmed. Not yet. But it is the first step in a sequence that has a direction. Lark wrote it in the ledger. The date, the nature of the transfer, the name of the witnessing attorney who was not local, who had been brought from somewhere else specifically for the purpose. She was beginning to understand the architecture of what Mabel was building. It was not crude. It was not the work of someone who had acted in haste or without forethought. It was the work of someone who had been building this particular kind of thing before, in some other place, with some other family, who knew how the sequence worked and how long each step required and how to make each step appear in isolation, like something other than what it was part of. The letter in the bottom of the bag, the name Mabel Greer on the envelope, the lawyer from Nashville who had written about a living husband in 1851. The woman who had arrived in this valley in 1852 with a new name and 3 sons in a story about being widowed that was, Lark now understood, a story she had told before, had perhaps told in more than one valley to more than one man, and that had never been successfully challenged because the people she told it to had not had the specific combination of evidence and circumstance and need that Lark now possessed. She thought about this in the second winter in the formation chamber, with a single candle burning in the still air, the light turning the calcite columns to gold and the shadows deep between them. She thought about what it would require to undo what Mabel had done. Not just the letter. The letter was the foundation, the load-bearing element of the case, but a foundation without a structure on top of it was just a slab in the ground. She needed the letter, and she needed the ledger, and she needed herself a living woman who could stand in a room and say what she knew and be believed, and she needed to be believed by someone with the authority to act on what they believed. She needed a judge, not the county justice who was a local man with local connections and who had been in Cedar Hollow long enough to have relationships with everyone in it, including possibly Mabel, who had been in Cedar Hollow long enough herself to have worked on whatever relationships were worth working on. She needed someone with standing above the local, someone whose authority derived from a source that local influence could not easily reach. She thought about this for a long time in the formation chamber, and in the main chamber, and in the nights when she lay on the pallet and looked at the cave ceiling and let the problem work on itself in the part of her mind that did its best thinking when she was not actively directing it. She was still thinking about it in January of 1856 when the boy came through the eastern passage. She heard him before she saw him. The cave had taught her to listen in a way she had not needed to listen before she came here, with the whole attention that a space of complete quiet requires when something in it changes. She was in the northern alcove checking the stores, and she heard the sound of someone moving through the eastern passage, the specific quality of an unfamiliar person, moving through an unfamiliar space, tentative and curious. Simultaneously, the sound of someone following something. Her first instinct was to take the candle and go deeper into the formation chamber, and then into the upper passage that led to the higher northern section, where she had spent occasional hours when the main chamber felt confining. She had done this once before when a child had come partway through the eastern passage before retreating without ever reaching the main chamber. She stood still in the alcove and listened. The footsteps continued. They had the quality not of a child's exploration, but of a young person following a specific trail, a person with a purpose rather than a wanderer. They reached the main chamber and stopped. She heard the change in the quality of the silence that happens when a person enters a larger space and understands suddenly that the space is larger than they expected. She stepped out of the northern alcove with the candle raised. He was perhaps 16 years old, standing at the edge of the ledge, above the river channel, holding a rabbit snare in one hand and looking at the assembled evidence of habitation in the main chamber, with an expression that was cycling through surprise and confusion, and something that was not quite fear, but was the precursor to it, the state that precedes fear, when the mind has not yet finished its assessment of whether fear is warranted. He was not afraid of the cave. She could see that clearly. He had come this far without hesitation, and he stood at the ledge with the specific quality of someone for whom underground spaces were interesting rather than threatening. Whatever fear was forming was not about where he was. It was about what he was looking at, which was the evidence that someone else had been here before him and was possibly still here. Then his eyes found her. The expression went through several more things and arrived somewhere that she watched with the quality of attention she had developed in 2 years of having only herself to pay attention to. Recognition was in it, the specific recognition of someone matching a face to a story they have been told. "You are Lark Caldwell," he said. It came out barely above speaking volume, the voice of someone who has just said something they were not certain they were going to say until they heard themselves say it. "Yes," Lark said, "but you are dead." He said it with genuine confusion rather than challenge. "Everyone says you drowned last winter." "Everyone," Lark said, "is wrong." He looked at her for a moment. Then he looked at the cave around him, at the fire pit and the organized stores, in the pallet, and the years of accumulated practical arrangement that the main chamber now contained. "You live here," he said. "I live here," she confirmed. He sat down on the limestone ledge. She made tea on the fire and they drank it on the ledge above the river channel, and she told him enough to explain the essential shape of things without telling him everything, because everything required more trust than a single afternoon could establish, and because she was after 2 years of complete secrecy, not yet practiced at calibrating how much of what she knew to share and with whom. His name was Cade Morrow. He was 16 years old and the son of farming people from the next valley far enough from the Caldwell land that the story of her drowning had reached him only in its simplified form, the version that survives the journey between communities in reduced condition, stripped to its essential elements. A girl had drowned. It was how life continued. He had followed a rabbit's trail to the eastern entrance that morning, had followed the trail inside out of hunting instinct rather than any knowledge of what the cave contained, and had arrived here. He would not tell anyone, he said. She looked at him. "Why not?" she said. He thought about this for a moment with the quality of someone who takes questions seriously. "Because whatever brought you here was yours to do," he said, "and whatever keeps you here is yours to keep." He looked at the cave around him with those curious eyes. "And because I would like to see this cave again." She considered him. She had been alone in the cave for 2 years, minus the visits from Idell. And in those 2 years, she had developed the specific discrimination of someone who has had a great deal of time to think about the difference between the kind of person who is safe to trust and the kind who is not. The difference being not in their stated intentions, but in the quality of their relationship with truth and with the autonomy of others. The quality she could see in Cade Morrow was not performed. It had the flatness of something that did not know it was being observed. "Come back next week," she said, "and bring me news of the North Road." He came back the following week, and the week after, and the week after that. He brought food when he could manage it, things that added variety to what the cave and the garden could provide, small luxuries, in the form of fresh eggs and cured pork, and the occasional wheel of hard cheese wrapped in cloth and carried across the ridge inside his coat. He brought books when he found them, a Bible with a cracked spine, a surveyor's manual, a volume of natural history whose taxonomic chapters on cave fauna she found unexpectedly relevant. He brought news, not the operational news that Idell brought, the news of legal filings and household changes. Cade's news was different, wider, the texture of life in the surrounding valleys, the people and the events, and the quality of things in the above-ground world that she no longer had direct access to, and that she found she needed in ways she had not fully understood until they arrived in his accounts. She told him about the letter. Not immediately. In the winter of 1856, after he had been coming for approximately 6 months, and she had built a sufficient understanding of him to know what she was trusting and why. She told him the essential facts, the envelope and the name and what it meant, and she watched him receive it with the same quality that had characterized everything she had learned about him, the quality of someone who takes things in fully before he responds to them. That letter, he said when she finished, is the reason you have to go back. Yes, Lark said, and the reason you have to wait until you can go back with it in a position to do what it needs to do. That too. He was quiet for a moment. You cannot go back as a dead woman, he said. A dead woman standing in a courtroom with a letter does not have standing. She is still a dead woman with a letter. I know. Then when you go back, he said, you need to go back as something the law can see. Not just alive. Recognize. The kind of person whose testimony in a legal proceeding has weight because they have the standing that a recognized person has. Lark looked at him. He was not saying something she had not thought. He was saying something she had thought and had been working through and had arrived at the same conclusion about. The difference was that hearing it from someone else, someone who had arrived at it independently, confirmed that the logic was sound and not just the product of her own wanting it to be sound. She thought about it for several more weeks. Then she thought about what the situation actually required, which was not just standing, but the specific standing that came from a particular kind of recognized status, the kind that the law of 1857 in Missouri gave readily and without complication to women who had it and gave not at all to women who did not. She thought about the way the law saw women in this time and this place and what it required of them and what it allowed them and what the single most effective form of the recognized standing she needed actually looked like when you stripped away the abstract description and looked at the concrete reality. In the spring of 1857, she told Cade that she wanted to marry him. She said it directly in the way she said most things without preamble or elaborate construction, because directness was the language she had learned in the cave, and she had no particular interest in abandoning it now. He looked at her for a moment. Yes, he said, with the same directness, the same absence of elaborate construction. They were married on a morning in April in the main chamber of the cave, with the underground river running in its channel below the ledge and the formation chamber visible through the western opening and the calcite columns catching the light of the candles they had arranged along the ledge for the occasion. Idel came through the eastern passage carrying wildflowers from the hillside, the first of the spring flowers that pushed through the Ozark soil before the trees had committed to their leaves, and she stood as witness, with those winter sky eyes carrying everything they carried. The ceremony was brief. The words were the essential ones. What was said completely and meant entirely and would last the full duration of what it was said to cover, which was everything from that morning forward. You are the most deliberately constructed person I have known, Idel said when it was done, looking at Lark with those eyes. It is not a compliment, Lark said. It is not meant as one, Idel confirmed. It is meant as the truth. Then I receive it as such. The summer of 1857 was productive in the specific way of Ozark summers, when the weather cooperates hot and generative and long, the garden yielding more than the 2 previous summers, combined the root cellar filling with the harvest in a way that confirmed the expanded planting had been worth the expanded labor. Cade worked the surface during the day and came to the cave in the evenings, living the double life of someone who has 1 foot in the above-ground world and 1 foot in something the above-ground world did not know existed. He brought news in October that required her to sit down. Fletcher, he said, he is ill. She had been half expecting this, had been tracking the information about her father's declining health through what Idel reported and what Cade observed and what the pattern of those observations suggested about direction. Half expecting did not mean fully prepared. How ill, she said. Cade's voice was careful. He fell from the wagon in September. Something in the back. He has not been right since. He is in bed most days. She sat with this. Mabel is pushing harder, Cade said. On the papers. She had a lawyer in from Springfield last week, and there was a long meeting at the house. What kind of papers, Lark said. The full transfer, he said, of the homestead. She has been building toward it for 3 years, and now she is moving to finish it. Lark understood the timing. Fletcher declining meant the window was closing. A man who was ill and in pain and dependent on the care of the woman beside him was a man in a position to sign things that a healthy man might question. Mabel had been patient, and now the patience had reached its conclusion, and she was moving to collect what the patience had been waiting for. The ledger, Lark said. She went to the northern alcove and brought it out, the pages filling now with 3 years of documented entries, dates and names and events, and the connected sequence of steps that made a picture clear only when you could see all of them together rather than each one in isolation. She sat on the ledge with the ledger in her lap. She thought about going back now before the papers were signed, while Fletcher was still alive, while the thing was still preventable. She thought about what that would require and what it would encounter. Her father in a bed in a house Mabel controlled. Mabel's three sons, the county justice who had been signing documents that Mabel needed signed, the valley that had been watching her footprints walk into the river for 3 years and had not expected her to walk out. She thought about the letter in the bottom of the bag. She needed that letter to land in the right room in front of the right person at a moment when everything required for it to do what it needed to do was in place. She needed it in front of a judge with the authority and the knowledge to understand what it proved and the standing to act on that understanding. She needed herself to be alive and documented and recognized in the legal sense. She needed, in short, everything to be ready. It was not ready yet. "I'm not going yet," she said. Cade looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know what that means. I know what it costs. But going now without what I need would be going to fail, and failing is not acceptable, because if I fail, there is no second chance. Mabel will make sure of that." He was quiet. She looked at the ledger in her lap. "I keep every entry," she said, "every date, every name, every step in the sequence. When I go back with 4 years of documented evidence in a letter that dismantles the legal foundation of everything she has built here. I go back with a husband who can testify to my existence and my state of mind and my whereabouts over the period in question. I go back ready, or I do not go back at all." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded the nod of someone who has assessed an argument and found it sound and is accepting it even though the acceptance is not comfortable. In December of 1857, on an icy road north of Cedar Hollow, Fletcher Caldwell's horse lost its footing on a frozen stretch of the county road, and Fletcher fell and did not get up. Idelle came the next morning earlier than her usual visits, coming through the eastern passage with her coat still on, not stopping to take it off, which told Lark the news before a word was spoken. When Lark said, "Yesterday," Idelle said, "the North Road." The horse slipped. They stood in the eastern passage with the December air coming in from the hillside and the cave's warmth at their backs, and Lark held what she had been handed with both hands, which was not metaphorical. She pressed her hands flat against each other and felt the pressure of them, and stood with the news the way you stand, with something that is both expected and worse than expected. She did not allow herself to stay in it for long. Not because the grief was not real, because the grief was real and large, and would be there when she had time for it, and right now she did not have time for it. "How long until she leaves?" Lark said. Idelle's face said she had already thought about this. "She is moving quickly," Idelle said. "There is a man from Kentucky she has been in correspondence with. A widower. She is not going to stay in this valley longer than she has to. The papers," Lark said. "The transfer." Idelle looked at her steadily. "She filed them this morning. The full transfer. The homestead and everything on it to Reuben Pruitt recorded with the county clerk." "The same morning Fletcher was buried," Lark said. For Idelle said, "Before the burial." Lark looked at the cave wall. "She is going to sell the property before she leaves," she said. "She will not leave this valley without converting the land to money she can carry." "That is my assessment also," Idelle said. "Then we have until spring," Lark said. "Maybe less." She went back to the main chamber and sat on the ledge and opened the ledger and read through it from the beginning, from the first entry to the last reading. It the way you read a document you need to know completely, not for the first time, but for the final time before the moment of its use. When Cade came that evening, she told him. They sat on the ledge above the river and they talked with the underground river running below them and the candles burning along the ledge and the formation chamber visible through the western opening about what the spring would require and who they would need to speak to and in what order and what the first morning back in the above-ground world would look like when it came. She went once more to the formation chamber that night alone with a single candle. She stood among the calcite columns in the gold light of the flame, and she let the cave be what it had been to her for 4 years, which was everything: home and protection and the specific freedom of a life that had been built from nothing by her own hands and sustained by her own intelligence and her own patience and the specific quality of determination that had brought her through the underground river on a January morning 4 years ago. She said goodbye to it in the way you say goodbye to places that have been essential to you, not in words which would have been insufficient, but in the quality of attention you bring to your last full encounter with something before you leave it. Then she went back to the main chamber, and she lay down on the pallet, and she looked at the cave ceiling, and she let the night be what it was. In the morning she began to prepare for spring. The preparations took the rest of December and all of January. Not physical preparations primarily. The physical things she needed were already in order, had been in order for months, the product of the sustained readiness of someone who has known for a long time that a specific moment is coming and has used the waiting time to make sure that when it arrives, the only variable remaining is the moment itself and not the state of her own preparation. What the December and January required was the other kind of preparation, the kind that happens in the mind, in the working and reworking of a plan, through every scenario she could construct, every direction the situation might go, and what the right response to that direction would be. She sat on the ledge in the evenings with the ledger in her lap and the underground river running below, and she thought through the sequence of what needed to happen from the moment she walked back into Cedar Hollow to the moment the situation was resolved, and she thought through every point in that sequence where something could go differently than she needed it to go and what she would do at each such point. Cade came every evening. They talked through the plan together, which was the second form of the preparation, the form that required speaking it aloud to another person and hearing their response, and discovering through that process the places where what seemed complete in her own mind had gaps in it that another mind could find. He was good at finding the gaps, not because he was looking for them exactly, but because he had the quality of a person who asks the next question, who does not accept the presented explanation as sufficient until he has understood not just what it says, but why it says that and not something else. She valued this in him enormously. She had valued things in him from the beginning, from the first evening on the ledge above the river channel, when he had sat down and answered her question about why he would not tell anyone with the particular directness of someone who had not prepared the answer and was therefore giving her the real one. Over the months and the years of his coming, she had added to the accounting of what she valued, building it with the slow accumulation of specific observations, the way the cave built its formations, one deposit at a time, each one small, and each one contributing to something that became over sufficient time, its own kind of permanent structure. She trusted him with her life. This was not a metaphor. This was the literal condition of her situation, and she held it with the clarity that the literal condition deserved. They argued once in January. She did not call it an argument because she did not like the word's implication of unresolved heat. It was a disagreement, substantive and productive, about the question of whether to contact Judge Whitmore before she appeared in Cedar Hollow, or to appear first and contact him afterward. Her position was to appear first, to walk into the town visible and undeniable, and let the fact of her existence precede the legal proceeding rather than be announced by it. The announcement could be managed. The fact of a living woman standing in the street could not be managed, could not be dismissed or reclassified or addressed through any of the channels that legal maneuvering could reach, because it was simply and absolutely real. Cade's position was to contact the judge first to establish the legal ground before she occupied it physically, to avoid the possibility of Mabel responding to her reappearance with some action before the legal proceeding could catch up to the reality. What action? Lark said. He was quiet for a moment. She is a woman who has been building something for 4 years, he said finally, and she is now in the process of dismantling it and leaving. She has the motivation of a person with something to lose and the freedom of someone who is already preparing to go somewhere no one can find her. If she knows you are coming, that window between your coming and your legal standing being established is a window she can use. Lark thought about this. She thought about the letter. She thought about what the letter proved and the conditions under which its proof would be accepted and what was required of her in order for it to be accepted. She thought about the sequence of events and the timing of Mabel's departure and what the ledger said about the pace at which Mabel moved when she was moving. You are right, she said. She said it without qualification. The way she said things, she meant. Cade looked at her. I am right that she could use the window, he said carefully. I am not certain I am right that contacting the judge first is better than going directly. She looked at him. I am telling you that you are right, she said. We write to Judge Whitmore first. He looked at her for a moment longer. Then he said, all right. They wrote the letter to Judge Whitmore in the second week of February. It was not easy to write, which was not a function of what they were saying, but of how to say it in a way that a judge who had never heard of Lark Caldwell would receive with the seriousness it required, rather than the dismissal that an implausible story told by a stranger to a person in authority tended to receive. She wrote 7 drafts. Not because the facts changed between drafts, but because the arrangement of the facts needed to do specific work on a specific reader, and the arrangement that did that work most efficiently took 7 attempts to find. The final letter was 3 pages. It stated the facts of her situation without embellishment and without the kind of appeal to sympathy that a person making an extraordinary claim sometimes employed in lieu of the evidence they did not have. She had evidence. The letter stated what the evidence was and why it was material to the legal question of the property transfer she was challenging. It named the document she had found and what it showed and when it had been written. It named the ledger and what it contained and over what period of time it had been compiled. It asked for nothing except a meeting. Cade carried the letter out through the surface world and sent it through the county postal service to Judge Aldous Whitmore's office address, which he had obtained on one of his trips to the county seat on ostensibly ordinary business. And then he came back to the cave and they waited. The response came in 3 weeks, which was faster than she had expected. It was a single page written in the controlled hand of a professional who expressed himself in the minimum number of words the content required. It said that he had received her letter and had found its contents sufficiently specific to warrant the meeting she requested. It named a date and a time and a location, a room in the county courthouse in Cedar Hollow private, and not on the docket. It said that he had made no other arrangements and taken no other action pending that meeting, and that he expected her to attend in person. She read it twice. The handwriting was even. The tone was neutral. It was the response of a man who had assessed what he had received and determined that it cleared the threshold of his attention without committing him to any particular position about its ultimate merits. That was exactly what she needed. She spent February preparing the materials she would bring to the meeting. The letter from the Nashville lawyer, which she removed from the oilcloth for the first time since she had placed it there, and examined carefully in the best light available in the cave, the light through the ceiling crack on a clear day, confirming that the writing was still fully legible, that the paper had survived 4 years of cave preservation in the condition of something that would be recognized as a genuine legal document by anyone qualified to assess it. The ledger, which she reviewed once more in its entirety, checking each entry for accuracy and completeness, adding a final entry for the date, and noting in it the letter from Judge Whitmore and the scheduled meeting, and herself. She prepared herself in the way that she had prepared for everything in the cave, with the thoroughness of someone for whom thoroughness was not a preference, but a method, who understood that the work that was not done before the moment arrived was work that could not be done during it. Idell came in the last week of February with news that changed the timing. Mabel, she said, is leaving earlier than expected. There is a buyer for the property, a man from outside the county. The sale is being rushed. How rushed? Lark said. Idell looked at her steadily. She is trying to complete the transfer before the spring thaw makes travel difficult. She wants to be gone before April. March, Cade said. She is moving in March, possibly late February, Idell said. Lark looked at the ledger. The meeting with Whitmore was scheduled for the second week of March. If Mabel completed the property sale and left before that date, the legal situation became significantly more complicated. Not impossible. The transfer could still be challenged after the fact. But the clean line from Mabel's presence to the invalid transaction to the challenge became more tangled when one of the parties to it was gone and the property had passed to a third person who might or might not have been acting in good faith. She thought about this for a moment. Then she said, I need to go sooner. Idell nodded, once the nod of someone who has already worked through the same calculation. Not the meeting date, Lark clarified. I cannot change the meeting date, but I need to be in Cedar Hollow, visible, present, alive in the eyes of the town before Mabel can complete the sale. Because a dead girl cannot contest a transaction, but a living woman can walk into the county clerk's office and tell them that the person authorizing the transaction does not have the legal standing to authorize it. Cade looked at her. The bigamy, he said. The bigamy, she confirmed. The moment I am standing in Cedar Hollow as a living woman, the moment the clerk and the town and anyone else who matters can see me and confirm I exist, I can go directly to the county clerk and state that the property transfer from my father's estate is being processed by a woman who was not legally married to my father and therefore has no claim on his estate. I do not need the judge for that part. I need the judge for the part that comes after when the challenge is made and the documentation needs to be examined by someone with the authority to rule on it. She looked at the ledger. The appearing is separate from the legal proceeding. The appearing just needs to happen before the sale is completed. When Cade said, she looked at him, she looked at Idell, now she said, she meant the next morning. That evening she packed what she was taking. Not much. The letter in its envelope inside the oilcloth inside the bag. The ledger wrapped in the same oilcloth. The clothes she had prepared for returning to the surface world. Her mother's hairbrush, which had been in the bag since the morning she left the cabin, and which she had kept in the specific way you keep things that are not useful in the ordinary sense, but whose presence is necessary in a way that exceeds ordinary usefulness. She left the other things. The stores organized in the northern alcove, the tools on their limestone hooks, the pallet on the western ledge, the fire pit with its ring of stones. 4 years of accumulated practical arrangement, the accumulated evidence of a life built in a place that had never expected to hold one built with patience and intelligence, and the specific stubbornness of someone who had decided that the cave was not a defeat but a choice, and had lived in it as a choice rather than as a defeat, and had become in the living of it someone that the girl who had walked into the river would not quite have recognized. She went through the formation chamber one more time. She held the candle up in the still air of it and turned slowly and looked at the calcite columns in their gold light, and she let the cave be entirely present to her in the way that things you are leaving for the last time can be present if you allow them that quality of attention. She had not been brought here. She had come here. There was a difference, and the difference was everything. She blew out the candle. In the morning before the light was full, she and Cade went through the eastern passage and out onto the hillside. The March air hit her face with the specific quality of March in the Ozarks, the quality of a season that is not yet committed, but is inclining toward warmth that carries the smell of thawing earth, and something else, something that is not quite the smell of a specific thing, but is the smell of change of one condition ending and another beginning. She stood on the hillside for a moment. The valley below was still in shadow. The farms and the road and the town at the valley's center laid out in the gray pre-dawn quiet of an early morning before the world had fully started itself. She could see the smoke from the first fires being lit in the farmhouses along the valley road. She could see the river, the surface river, the one that ran along the valley floor, and was entirely different from the river that had given her passage 4 years ago. She could see at the far end of the valley the shape of what had been the Caldwell cabin. Cade stood beside her. She did not say anything, and he did not say anything, and the silence between them was the silence of two people who have said what needed saying and are now in the place beyond where words do useful work. Then she started down the hill. They came into Cedar Hollow from the east, following the county road, in from the ridge, arriving at the edge of town in the early morning when the street was just beginning to acquire its daily population. The general store was opening. The smithy was firing up, the sound of it reaching them before the building was visible. A man she did not recognize was driving a wagon loaded with feed along the main street. She walked into Cedar Hollow. The first person who saw her saw a woman walking on the main street and registered this without reaction, because women walked on the main street of Cedar Hollow every morning, and there was nothing about the specific woman walking on it now to cause any particular reaction beyond the ordinary awareness of another person in the street. Then the person looked more carefully. She watched the recognition happen the way she had anticipated it would happen, the sequence of it moving across the face with the specific quality of something that the mind is producing, and simultaneously rejecting the face of someone whose pattern-matching capacity is returning a result that the rest of their cognitive apparatus is not prepared to accept. The person said nothing. They stopped walking. They stood in the street and looked at her. She nodded and kept walking. The second person to see her was a woman she remembered from before, a woman who had been a member of the congregation at the church, who had attended the memorial service, who had told people after that it was a sad business, and the poor girl had clearly been troubled. She turned from the door of the dry goods establishment and saw Lark, and her hand went to her mouth. Lark kept walking. By the time she reached the county clerk's office, there were perhaps 8 people who had seen her, and approximately 4 of them had followed at a distance, the following distance of people who have witnessed something they believe is impossible and are not yet certain how to categorize what they are witnessing. The county clerk was a man named Hartley, who had been doing the job since before Lark was born, and who was known throughout the county for his specific combination of thoroughness and imperturbability, his capacity to process whatever the county's legal and administrative life presented him with in the same even manner, regardless of its content. He looked up when she came through the door. He looked at her for approximately 5 seconds. Then he said, "Miss Caldwell." "Mrs. Morrow," she said. "But yes, you are," he said. He paused. He was a man who chose his words deliberately. He started again. "You are alive." "I am," she said. "I have been alive for the past 4 years in this county on the eastern side of the ridge above the old Ketchum homestead. I can provide witnesses and documentation for this." She set the ledger on his counter. She did not yet take out the letter. The letter was for the judge. The ledger was for the clerk. "She is trying to sell the Caldwell homestead," Lark said. "Mabel Pruitt Caldwell. She filed a transfer of the property to her son Reuben Pruitt approximately 3 months ago, and she is now attempting to complete the sale to an outside buyer." "I am aware of the filing," Hartley said. He was looking at her with the careful attention of a man who has understood that whatever is happening in his office right now is something he needs to understand completely before he responds to it. "I am contesting it," Lark said, "on 2 grounds. First, because I am the legal heir to my father's estate, and I was alive at the time of my father's death, and a living heir cannot be bypassed in an estate distribution without their knowledge and consent. Second, because the person filing the transfer is not and was not legally married to my father, and therefore has no claim on his estate in any capacity." Hartley looked at her. "That is a significant claim," he said. "I have documentation," she said. He looked at the ledger on the counter. He looked at her. "I have a meeting scheduled with Judge Whitmore in 2 weeks," she said. "I will present the full documentation at that time. What I am asking of you this morning is simply that you place a hold on the property sale pending that proceeding. I am a living person with legal standing to contest this transaction, and I am contesting it. That is all that is required at this stage." Hartley looked at the ledger for a moment. Then he looked at her again. He was a man whose job required him to act on the information before him and to act on it correctly the first time, because errors in his records had the kind of consequences that were difficult to correct and that he had avoided throughout his career through the consistent application of thoroughness. "I will place a hold on the pending transaction," he said. "Pending the legal proceeding." "Thank you," Lark said. She picked up the ledger from the counter. She turned and walked out of the clerk's office and into the main street of Cedar Hollow, which had acquired considerably more people in the time she had been inside, people who had apparently received some form of the information that was moving through the town with the speed that information moves in small communities when it is sufficiently remarkable. They were standing in the street, not in a crowd exactly, in the arrangement of individuals who have arrived at the same location from different directions and have found themselves collectively in the presence of something they were not prepared for. She looked at them. She recognized most of them. She had grown up in this valley. She knew the names and the faces and the histories and the specific nature of each person's connection to everything that had happened since she was 12 years old, and her mother died, and the long sequence of events was set in motion that had culminated in her standing here on this March morning, having arrived from the east, from the direction of a ridge that everyone in this valley believed she had never crossed. She was not angry. She had expected to be angry, had prepared for the possibility that the accumulated weight of 4 years of being dead in the eyes of people who should have known her, 4 years of moving through the surface world as a ghost because of a woman who had never had the right to make her, that would arrive in this moment as a full reckoning that anger would be the natural response to. What she felt instead was something quieter and more complete than anger. The specific quality of a person who has come through a very long passage and is standing in the light on the other side of it, looking at the world that had believed them gone and finding that the world looks different from this side. Not worse, simpler. She walked through the gathered people toward the place she needed to go next. The road north out of town ran along the valley floor for approximately a mile before it reached the Caldwell property. She had not walked this road in 4 years. She had seen it from the ridge, from the hillside, from the eastern entrance of the cave in the gray early mornings when she came to the surface for the garden. She had not walked it. It looked the same. The way roads look the same when you have been away long enough that your absence has not coincided with any particular change in them, when they have simply continued being roads without any significant event and are therefore unchanged by the time you return to them. They passed the river bend where the path to Idell's cabin turned off the main road, and there it was. She had not known it was there. Cade beside her was quiet in the way of someone who has been aware of a thing and has not known whether to mention it and has made a decision not to and is now present with the consequences of that decision. It was a small marker, perhaps 2 feet tall, set in the ground at the edge of the riverbank, at the exact point where the footprints had walked into the water in January of 1854. Someone had placed it there, had driven a wooden post into the frozen bank and painted the words on it in the careful lettering of someone who was not a professional sign maker, but was doing the work with as much care as they possessed. In memory of Lark Caldwell, it said, 1837 to 1854, may she rest. She stood and looked at it. The river moved past the bank with the indifference of rivers carrying everything it received without commentary or preference, the same river that had received her 4 years ago and had taken the false record of her death and had delivered her through the underground passage to the other side. She stood at the bank where her footprints had walked into the water. She was alive, not in the abstract sense of breathing and functioning, though those things were also true. Alive in the specific sense of a person who has made choices in full knowledge of what they cost and has arrived at the far end of those choices and is standing in the place the choices were made to bring them to. She looked at the marker for a long moment. Then she looked at the river. Then she turned and walked north toward the Caldwell property, toward whatever was waiting there. The cabin looked smaller than her memory of it. This was the reliable effect of returning to the places of childhood, the way scale reduces in memory, to the proportions of the person who originally experienced it and then reveals itself in reality to have always been ordinary. She stood at the edge of the yard and looked at the structure that had been the entire physical world of her first 17 years, and she registered its ordinary dimensions and its ordinary condition. And the oak tree at the south corner that had grown in the 4 years she had been gone, the increased circumference of its trunk, the one visible record of the passage of time in a yard that was otherwise much as she had left it. The wagon was in the yard. It was a loaded wagon, the wagon of a household in the process of being moved, furniture and household goods arranged in the bed with the efficient practicality of someone who has done this before and knows how to make the most of the available space. 3/4 loaded, Lark assessed, not complete. The loading was not complete. Mabel came out of the cabin door. She was carrying a wooden box, one of the boxes that Lark recognized from the kitchen. The box that had held her mother's good dishes, the ones brought from wherever Clara Caldwell had come from before she married Fletcher, and that had sat on the kitchen shelf as evidence that her mother had once been a person with a history prior to this valley and this cabin. Mabel stopped when she saw Lark. The box in her arms was still in her arms. She did not drop it. She was not a woman who dropped things, not even in moments of significant surprise. She held it and she looked at Lark across the yard with the expression of someone running a very rapid calculation. "Put the box down," Lark said. Her voice came out in the key she had intended, the key of something that has been decided. Not raised, not theatrical, entirely certain. Mabel set the box on the porch step. She looked at Lark with the expression she had arrived at on the far side of her calculation, the expression of someone who has assessed the field and is not yet certain of the outcome, but has identified the move that gives them the best chance from the current position. "You are supposed to be dead," she said. "I know what I am supposed to be," Lark said. "I know exactly what you arranged for me to be." They looked at each other across the yard. Lark felt Cade beside her, his presence a specific and reliable weight on her right side. She felt the bag in her hand, the ledger inside it, the letter in the oilcloth at the bottom of the bag. She felt the morning air on her face and the March ground under her feet in the 4 years of preparation that had brought her to this yard on this morning to stand exactly here. "I have been to the county clerk," she said. "The property sale is on hold pending a legal proceeding with Judge Whitmore, which is scheduled for 2 weeks from now. You will not complete this sale before that proceeding, and you will not leave this county before that proceeding, and you will have the opportunity to respond to the evidence I will present at that proceeding. She paused. I have a letter, she said, postmarked July 1851, addressed to Mrs. Mabel Greer, from a lawyer in Nashville, Tennessee, regarding your first husband, who was alive in July of 1851, who was alive when you arrived in this valley, who was alive when you married my father. She let this land. Your marriage to Fletcher Caldwell was not valid, Mabel. You were never his wife. You have no claim on his estate and no right to sell his property and no legal standing to have filed any of the documents you have filed in this county under the name Caldwell. Mabel's face was controlled. The control was extraordinary. She was a woman who had spent decades building and maintaining a specific kind of control over her face and her expression and the information they communicated. And even now, even in this yard on this morning, with a woman she had sent to her death, standing in front of her alive and documented and in possession of the one piece of evidence that dismantled everything she had built, the control held. But something moved in her eyes, something that was not calculated and not performed. You have 2 weeks, Lark said. I will see you at the proceeding. She turned and walked back out of the yard. She did not look back. 2 weeks. The 2 weeks between her return and the proceeding with Judge Whitmore were unlike any other 2 weeks she had experienced. They had the specific quality of a period that knows it is a period that has a defined endpoint, that everything in it is oriented toward where the ordinary passage of time has been reorganized by the event at the end of it. She stayed at Cade's family's farm on the east side of the valley. His parents received her with the particular quality of welcome that people offer when they are receiving someone back from a place they did not fully understand and are doing their best with the limits of their comprehension. She did not require them to understand. She required only the roof and the food and the sleep that the farm provided, and these she received without complication. Cedar Hollow managed the fact of her existence in the way that small communities manage the introduction of information that requires them to revise a settled understanding. There was disruption, the necessary disruption of a narrative being altered, and then there was adjustment, the equally necessary adjustment, of people who find that the world is not precisely what they believed it to be and who update their beliefs accordingly. Some of the adjustment was immediate. People came to the Morrow farm in the first days. Not all of them with the same quality of response. Some came with the specific quality of relief that comes when a thing you were told was one way turns out to be another way. That is, better people who had known Lark before and had carried some version of doubt about the story of the drowning that they had suppressed for 4 years, because suppressing it was easier than confronting it. They came and they stood in the farm kitchen, and they said things that were attempts to address 4 years of complicated relationship with a truth they had not been willing to hold. She received them with the equanimity that 4 years of cave time had given her. Not forgiveness exactly, not in the specific sense of releasing something that had been held against them. The equanimity of someone who has been through something that put the ordinary measures of social slight into accurate proportion and who no longer had significant energy to spend on what people had believed when the alternative was too difficult for them. She spent the 2 weeks in the preparation of her presentation to Judge Whitmore. She organized the material in the order she would present it, from the letter, which was the foundation, through the ledger, which was the documentation of the pattern, to her own testimony, which was the capstone, the living account of the person who had been present through all of it and who could speak to the connection between each element. Cade helped her. He helped her the way he had always helped her, by asking the next question, and the question after that, by finding the gaps that the presentation could not afford to have in it, and bringing them to her attention in the precise and useful way of someone who understands that finding a weakness before the proceeding is worth infinitely more than encountering it during it. On the morning of the meeting, she dressed in the clothes she had prepared for it. She picked up the bag. She looked at the cave one more time in her mind, the formation chamber with its gold light, and the main chamber with the river running below the ledge, and the eastern passage that she had climbed through on the morning she came back to the surface world. She held it in her mind for a moment with the specific quality of gratitude that she felt for it, the gratitude of someone for whom a place had been everything and who understood that clearly and was not going to pretend otherwise. Then she walked to the courthouse. Judge Aldous Whitmore was 61 years old and had been a judge in this part of Missouri for 22 years, which was long enough to have seen a considerable range of what human beings were capable of in the territory between legitimate dispute and outright fraud, and to have developed a comprehensive and generally accurate taxonomy of the difference. He looked at Lark when she came into the private room with the quality of a man who had read her letter and had formed a preliminary assessment and was now comparing that assessment to the reality of the person in front of him. She put the bag on the table. She took out the letter. She took out the ledger. She laid them on the table in front of him, and she sat down across from the evidence she had been carrying for 4 years in a cave in the Ozark Hills, and she said, "I am ready to begin." Judge Whitmore looked at the materials on the table. He looked at her. Then he picked up the letter from Nashville. He read it. He read it with the specific speed of a professional reader of legal documents, the speed of someone who can move through text at a rate that processes both its content and its implications simultaneously. He set it down. He picked up the ledger and opened it to the first entry and read the date in the description and turned to the next entry and read that. He went through the first 10 entries. Then he put the ledger down and looked at her with the expression that she had been preparing for the expression of a man who has received information that is requiring him to assemble several things he knows into a new arrangement. The name on the letter, he said. Mabel Greer. Yes, she said. And you have reason to believe this is the same person as the woman who arrived in this valley as Mabel Pruitt in 1852. I have more than reason, Lark said. I have 4 years of documented observation of a woman who has operated using the same methods in this county that the letter from Nashville describes her having previously employed in Sumner County, Tennessee. I have the property transfers filed with the county clerk following the same sequence. I have the pattern. Whitmore looked at the letter again. I will need to verify the letter's provenance, he said. I will need to contact Nashville. I understand, Lark said. I have had 4 years to prepare for this, and I will wait as long as the verification requires. He looked at her. She met his gaze with the specific quality of someone who has nothing to hide and knows it and is entirely comfortable with the scrutiny that the knowledge produces. He picked up the ledger and began to read more carefully. She sat across from him and let him read, and she looked at the wall of the room and she thought about the cave and the constant temperature and the underground river and the sound it made in the dark when she was lying on the pallet trying to sleep, that sound, which was the sound of water knowing exactly where it was going and going there with complete commitment, the sound of something that had found its course and would follow it as long as the geology held. She had found her course. She had found it the morning she walked into the river. She was following it now here in this room at this table across from a judge who was reading the evidence she had carried through an underground passage and preserved in a cave and brought back out into the light on a March morning, 4 years after a woman who was not a widow had told her to go. Outside the window of the courthouse, Cedar Hollow was conducting its ordinary morning business, the horses and the wagons and the people moving through the streets with the ordinary urgency of ordinary days, the town that had watched her die and was now in the process of understanding that she had not. She had not. The river had not taken her. It had given her something instead, something that could not have been given any other way, something that she carried in the bag on the table in front of a judge who was reading it carefully, and in herself in the quality of person that 4 years of underground living and underground thinking had made of the 17-year-old girl who had walked into the January water. Whitmore finished the ledger. He set it down. He looked at her across the table with the expression of someone who has completed an assessment and arrived at a conclusion. Tell me, he said from the beginning. Tell me everything. She told him. The first thing she did was explore. Not immediately. Immediately she lay on the limestone ledge and breathed and let her body work through the inventory of what had just happened to it, which was considerable. The cold of the river had moved into her bones in the way that river cold in January moves, not just against the skin, but through it, claiming the deeper territories of muscle and joint with the patient thoroughness of something that believes it has already won. Her clothes were soaked through. Her hands, when she looked at them in the pale light from the ceiling crack, were a color they were not supposed to be. She untied the rope from her waist and pulled the beck hand over hand through the water until she had it on the ledge beside her. The oilcloth had done its work. She opened the bag and found everything inside damp on the surface and dry beneath the candles, intact, the flint dry, the food in its wrappings still sound. The paper at the bottom was dry. She held it up in the thin January light from the ceiling crack and confirmed this with the specific attention of someone who understands that the thing they are confirming matters more than most things. And then she put it back and closed the bag and stood up carefully on the limestone ledge and began to take stock of where she was. The chamber was larger than she had been able to assess lying on her back in the first minutes. It extended perhaps 40 feet in diameter, the ceiling varying in height from perhaps 15 feet at the edges to something she could not accurately estimate at the center where the crack of light entered. The river ran through the center of it in a channel it had carved over centuries, moving with purpose toward the eastern end of the chamber, where it disappeared into another passage and continued its underground journey to wherever it eventually surfaced again. On the western side of the chamber above the waterline, a broad ledge of limestone ran the full width of the space. Dry. Flat enough. Above it, the wall was relatively smooth, the kind of smooth that comes not from human effort, but from the long, patient work of water that has touched a surface enough times over enough centuries to leave it polished. There were passages. She counted 3 visible from the ledge, dark openings in the cave walls that led away into the hill in directions she could not yet determine. One low and wet, the sound of moving water audible from its entrance. One at roughly her own height, dry its walls showing the white formations of calcite deposit that caught the thin light and threw it back in small, uncertain sparks. One higher up, accessible by a natural staircase of ledges, its darkness total, and therefore offering nothing about what lay beyond it. She ate something from the bag because her body required it regardless of what the rest of her was occupied with. She changed her outer clothes for the dry ones in the bag, which did not solve the problem entirely, but addressed the most urgent part of it. She spread the wet things on the ledge, where the air of the cave would work on them, with the same constant temperature that Hetty had described, the 55 degrees, that neither froze things nor warmed them to summer comfort, but held everything in a state of steady livability. Then she took a candle and lit it and went to look at the dry passage. This was the beginning of the weeks she would spend learning the cave the way you learn any language, which is to say imperfectly at first, and then with increasing fluency, and then finally with the ease of someone who no longer has to think about the grammar, because the grammar has become the way their mind naturally moves. Hetty had been right about the system being larger than she had initially described, or perhaps she had described it accurately, and the scale of it had simply not translated to Wren's imagination until the reality of it was moving past her in the candlelight. The dry passage led to a second chamber, smaller than the first, but with a ceiling high enough to stand in throughout its walls covered in formations, that the candlelight turned extraordinary columns of calcite in shades of cream and rust, and a white so pure it seemed to emit its own light, curtains of flowstone draped from the ceiling, like frozen waterfalls, stalactites of every dimension, from the size of a finger to structures taller than she was, that had been building themselves from a single drop of mineral water at a time since before her grandmother's grandmother was born. She stood in that chamber for a longish time with the candle held up and turned slowly and looked at it. She had grown up in the hills. She understood that the hills were full of caves, that the limestone country went down further than anyone's life required them to investigate, that underground worlds existed in the dark below the surface world, without any need for the surface world's awareness or permission. She had heard stories about caves, had known people who explored them, had always had the specific awareness of the Ozarks landscape that comes from living in it rather than merely passing through. She had not understood in any experiential sense what a cave was. She understood it now. Not as a place of fear, which was how the surface world tended to characterize things that could not be seen from the surface, but as a place of complete and total otherness, a space that operated by different rules than the world above, that had its own logic and its own beauty and its own claim on the attention of anyone who entered it honestly. She explored for 2 days before she went to the Ketchum homestead. The passage system, as she mapped it in her memory, had 4 distinct areas. The main chamber where the river ran through, which she thought of as the center of everything. The formation chamber to the west, beautiful and useless for practical purposes, except as a reminder that not everything needed to be useful. A long, dry passage to the north that ended in a flowstone wall after perhaps 200 feet, but contained along its length several natural alcoves large enough to store things and dry and protected from the river's moisture. And the passage to the east which she had to climb to reach, and which proved, after some careful navigation in the candlelight, to lead eventually to the eastern entrance on the far side of the ridge, the entrance that opened onto the hillside a quarter-mile from the Ketchum barn. The entrance was overgrown. A tangle of dead brush had established itself across the opening in the years since anyone had used it, and the opening itself was lower than she would have preferred, requiring a crouch to pass through. But it was sufficient, and it was hidden well enough by the brush and by the steep angle of the hillside above it that she felt confident a person walking the ordinary routes near the old homestead would not notice it. The Ketchum place itself was in the state that abandoned things reach after a decade of being left to their own devices, which is to say the state of something that is losing the argument with the natural world, but has not yet fully conceded. The cabin had lost 3 of its roof boards on the north side, and the floor had gone soft in the northwest corner, where water had gotten in through the gap. The barn was in better condition, its roof intact, and its walls sound, the kind of construction that had been built to outlast its original purpose, and was doing so. The root cellar was the best of all of it, dug into the hillside at the back of the barn, with stone walls that had not moved, and a wooden door that had swollen in its frame but yielded in when she put her shoulder against it. Inside the root cellar, exactly as Hetty had said, were the stores. 10 years of absence had taken a toll, as 10 years of absence will. Many of the vegetables that had been stored had long since resolved themselves into dust and the memory of vegetables. Several of the crocks had cracked in some long-past freeze, and their contents were unsalvageable. But the Ketchum family had been thorough in their provisions, and had put up enough variety that what remained after a decade of loss was still substantial. Sealed jars of preserved fruit that had held their seals, dried beans in wrapped cloth that the mice had not entirely reached, cured meat in a crock sealed with a layer of fat that had hardened into an effective barrier, a barrel of dried corn, salt, 2 kinds of dried herbs she recognized from her mother's kitchen, tools on the barn wall, an axe, 2 hoes, their handles dried but structurally sound, rope in coils on a hook, a mattock, a spade. She carried what she could through the hillside entrance to the cave, making the trip 4 times in the remaining daylight, and piling the supplies in the dry northern alcove where they would keep in the cave's constant temperature. She went back for the tools on the second day and stowed them in the same alcove. She went back for the rope. She established herself in the main chamber on the broad western ledge that she had identified as the best sleeping place, as far from the river's moisture as the chamber allowed, and close enough to the formation chamber to use it as a secondary space when the main chamber felt too small. She built a fire pit of loose stones at the edge of the ledge, understanding from Hetty that the cave's natural ventilation through the various passages and the ceiling crack was sufficient to draw smoke upward and out without filling the chamber. She tested this the first evening. The fire caught and burned, and the smoke rose and moved toward the ceiling and dispersed into the passages above with a tidiness that she would never take for granted, the way you never take for granted things that could have gone otherwise. She sat by the fire on the limestone ledge of a cave in the Ozark Hills, and she ate heated preserved beans from a Ketchum jar, and she was alive, and she was warm, and no one in the world knew where she was, which was both the loneliest thing she had ever experienced and the most completely free. The loneliness came later, not immediately. In the first weeks, there was too much to do, too much practical necessity pressing on her attention from every direction for the loneliness to gain the kind of purchase it needed to do its full work. She built out the living space on the western ledge, improving it incrementally, with each day adding the things that the difference between surviving and living with some measure of sanity required. A proper pallet for sleeping assembled from the materials she salvaged from the Ketchum cabin. A system for the food stores that kept them organized and accessible. A place for the tools. A place for the candles, enough of which she had brought from Hetty's, and enough of which she found in the Ketchum cabin that she could afford to burn one through the evening hours rather than sitting in the dark after the fire burned down. The fire was important. Not just for warmth, though. The cave's constant temperature meant warmth was less urgently necessary than it would have been in the surface world in January. The fire was important because it was light in a place that the sun never reached, and light was what the mind required to remain oriented in a space where all other cues of time and direction were absent. Without the fire, the cave had no day or night. Without the fire, the hours dissolved into each other without landmarks. She kept the fire burning. She explored the rest of the passages in the second week, following each one to its end, with a candle and a piece of chalk she found in the Ketchum cabin that she used to mark her route on the walls, the marks small and inconspicuous, but sufficient for her own navigation. She found two more small chambers to the north that she had missed on the first survey. She found a pool in the lower passage that was fed by a seep from the aquifer below, and whose water was the clearest and coldest she had ever tasted. Standing in water with the quality of something that had been filtered through 1,000 feet of limestone and had arrived at its current state, purified of everything except itself. She found bats, thousands of them in the highest reaches of the formation chamber, where the ceiling rose to a height she could not estimate, clustered in masses that shifted and rustled when she raised the candle and dispersed when she moved too close with a sound that was not frightening once you had heard it enough times to understand what it was. Their guano covered the floor of the formation chamber in a layer that had been accumulating for longer than the Aldridge family had been in these hills. She did not immediately understand what this meant, practically speaking, until she thought about what she knew of gardening and soil amendment and the specific richness of nitrogenous material applied to ground that needed it. She thought about the kitchen garden she had tended at the cabin for 5 years, about the cleared ground near the Ketchum barn, which was not in the shadow of trees and which had the southern exposure that most things preferred. She began planning a garden, not for immediate need, for the long need, for the version of this life that extended past the food in the root cellar, past the preserved jars and the dried beans and the cured meat that would eventually run out past the January of 1854 and into whatever seasons followed it. She was going to be here for longer than she could currently see the end of. She had no reason to go back, and several reasons not to. The surface world had her footprints walking into a river and nothing walking out. If she intended to live, which she did, she intended to live well enough to do it for a long time. Hetty came in February. She came the way Wren had come through the surface world to the eastern entrance, moving through the dead February brush with a sureness of foot that suggested she had been to this entrance before, or had simply spent enough decades moving through Ozark Hills that the movement had become its own form of knowledge. She was carrying a bag. Wren heard her before she saw her, the sound of someone moving through the brush outside the entrance, and went through the eastern passage to meet her. They looked at each other. "How are you?" Hetty said. Wren told her honestly, which took longer than it would have if the answer had been simple. Hetty listened. Then she put down the bag and took out what she had brought: additional candles, a sack of cornmeal, 2 books that had been on the shelf in her cabin, and a small jar of something that turned out to be a salve for the skin condition that underground living and cave water had produced on Wren's hands in the first weeks. She had also brought news. Silas had come back from Springfield on the Friday after the supposed drowning to find Josephine and her account waiting for him. Hetty described his reaction in the careful way of someone choosing what to include and what to withhold, which told Wren on as much as the actual content did. He had gone to the river. He had stood at the bank and looked at the footprints, which were still visible in the snow that had not yet melted. He had not spoken for 2 days. Josephine had arranged a small memorial service at the church in town that Sunday. Silas had attended it and had sat in the front pew, looking at nothing. "He grieves," Hetty said. "Whatever else is true about that man, he grieves genuinely." Wren said nothing. She said nothing because she was managing something, managing it with the care of someone who knows that if they stop managing it for even a moment, it will get out and do damage that cannot be entirely repaired. The knowledge that her father was sitting in a church pew at her memorial service was a specific kind of pain that had no adequate comparison available to her, and that she had been keeping in the peripheral vision of her consciousness since the moment she understood it would be there. "What about the land?" she asked. Hetty's expression changed slightly. "Josephine has Jonas working the south field. Told Silas the boy needed the practice and the field needed the attention. He agreed to this." Hetty was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Your father is not a man who fights well when he's grieving. He never has been." Wren knew this. She had watched it in the years after her mother's death, the way grief had made him passive to things he would not have been passive to, otherwise the way Josephine had arrived in that passivity and established herself in it so thoroughly that by the time he was out the other side, the establishment was complete. She said nothing about the document in her bag, not because she didn't trust Hetty, but because the document was hers to manage, and she had decided on the night she found it that it would remain hers until the time came when it could be used, and that time required circumstances that did not yet exist. Hetty came 4 more times that winter. Each time she brought news and supplies, and each time Wren listened to the news with the specific quality of attention that is required when information is the only form of connection available to you with the world you have left behind, when you have no other way of knowing what is happening except through this single channel, and the channel has limits and gaps, and the areas between its visits are long. In March, Hetty brought news that made Wren sit down on the limestone ledge and look at the cave wall for a long time without speaking. "Your father has been looking for you," Hetty said. Wren looked at her, quietly, without telling Josephine. He hired Ned Colton, who finds things for people to follow the river south. Paid him from savings that Josephine doesn't know about. "The river runs fast in winter," Wren said carefully. "There would be nothing to find." "That's right." Hetty looked at her steadily. "There's nothing for Ned Colton to find because there's nothing there to find. But your father doesn't fully believe the river took you. He has a feeling which is not evidence and which he can't act on publicly, but which he has been acting on privately by paying Ned Colton to check the sandbars south of here." Wren absorbed this. "He loves you," Hetty said. "I want you to be clear about that. I want you to hold on to that and not let the other things displace it." What other things Wren said, though she already knew. "Josephine found out about Ned Colton last week. She told your father that if he continued looking, she would take what she had and leave, and she would take her boys with her, and she would leave him alone. And he stopped." Wren said, "He stopped." Hetty confirmed. The quality of the silence in the cave after this was different from the ordinary silence of an underground space, which was already a silence of a specific density, the silence of a place removed from wind and birds, and all the surface sounds that the surface world produces constantly without meaning to. This silence had something additional in it, the weight of a particular piece of knowledge settling into its permanent place in the structure of what Wren understood about her life. Her father had chosen the life Josephine provided over the search for his daughter. She understood why. She understood it clearly and without sentimentality, which was the way she was beginning to understand most things, with the specific clarity that comes from having very few distractions and a great deal of time to think. He was a man past 50 who had lost his first wife and then believed he had lost his daughter, and who was faced with the prospect of losing the new structure of his life as well. And he had made the calculation that a surviving man makes, which is the calculation about what he can still hold on to versus what is already beyond holding. He had made the wrong calculation. She knew this. She knew it without condemning him for it, which was a more difficult thing to accomplish than simply knowing it. She kept the paper. The first summer was the beginning of everything she was going to build. She planted the garden in April, working the cleared ground near the Ketchum barn with the Ketchum tools and the guano she had hauled from the formation chamber through the eastern passage in a series of trips that left her arms aching and her sense of purpose entirely intact. She planted beans and corn and squash and the kitchen herbs that she knew from her mother's garden and had found the seeds of in the Ketchum stores. She planted in the pre-dawn and the late evening, working in the gray hours when the ridge above blocked the low light and she was unlikely to be visible from the valley road a half-mile away. She was a ghost, a practical ghost, a ghost who grew corn and preserved food and improved her underground living space with the systematic attention of someone making a permanent home rather than a temporary shelter, but a ghost nonetheless, and she moved through the surface world that could see her with the specific care of something that understands its invisibility as both its primary protection and its most important tool. There were stories Hetty told her in the autumn. People had seen a light on the ridge at night. People had seen movement near the Ketchum place at hours when sensible people were in their beds. One woman at the north end of the valley was telling anyone who would listen that she had seen the Aldridge girl walking on the ridge road by moonlight, still wearing the dress she had drowned in her hair wet. Wren's hair was not wet when she walked the ridge. She had cut it short in June, a practical decision about cave life, and the management of it that she did not regret. But the story was useful. Ghost stories were useful because they kept people away from things that ghost stories attach themselves to, and a story about a drowned girl walking the ridge at night was an effective deterrent to casual exploration of the area around the Ketchum homestead. She did nothing to discourage the story. The second winter was easier than the first. She had the garden's harvest in the root cellar, now added to what remained of the Ketchum stores. She had the cave's constant temperature, and her fire and her candles, and the two books Hetty had brought that she had read enough times to have moved beyond the text and into a sustained conversation with them. She had the silence which she had ceased to fight against, and had begun cautiously and then with increasing commitment to inhabit rather than endure. She learned things about silence in that second winter that she suspected most people never learned because most people never had sufficient access to it. She learned that silence was not absence. It was presence of a different kind, the presence of the thing itself rather than the presence of commentary on it. In the surface world, experience arrived always already narrated by the sounds and voices around it, never quite able to be itself without the interpretation. In the cave in the deep winter silence with only the fire in the river and the occasional sound of water dripping from the ceiling, experience arrived unmediated. She thought about her mother in that second winter more than she had thought about her in the years since her death, which had been years of too much work and too many other people's needs to allow for the extended contemplation that grief properly required. In the cave in the winter, she could think about her mother with the full attention that her mother deserved, and she did. She thought about the hairbrush that had been her mother's, which was in the bag, which she kept near the pallet, because some things need to be near you regardless of their practical utility. In the second spring, she expanded the garden. In the second summer, she began leaving the cave's eastern entrance during the day, as well as the evenings working the ground and tending the plants in the full light of the Ozark summer, confident enough in the isolation of the Ketchum hillside and the deterrent of the ghost stories to move with less caution than she had imposed on herself in the first year. She was weeding beans in the late afternoon of a Thursday in the 2nd July, her hands in the warm soil, the sun on her back, the ridge above her, throwing its late shadow across the lower portion of the garden, when Hetty arrived with news that required her to stop what she was doing and sit down on the root cellar steps. "Jonas is on the south field," Hetty said without preamble. "Not working it anymore. Eli has been given the north pasture. Your father signed the papers last month." "Signed what papers?" "Transfer papers." Josephine had documents drawn up transferring use rights of the Southfield and North Pasture to her sons. "Your father signed them." Hetty paused. "The same lawyer who witnesses the debt instrument was the one who drew these up. The same lawyer. Josephine brought him from Springfield. He has no connections here and owes nothing to anyone local who might know your family." She's been careful. Wren thought about this for a moment. Then she said, "Is use rights, not ownership, for now," Hetty said. They looked at each other. "She's building it in steps," Wren said. "The debt document first to create the mechanism. Now use rights for her sons to establish their presence on the land. When my father dies, the debt comes due, and there's no one to contest the transfer." "No one except a dead girl," Hetty said. Wren said nothing. "Do you still have the paper?" Hetty asked. Wren went inside and came back with it and held it out. Hetty looked at it but did not take it. "Kept safe," she said, "is more important than produced too soon. You produce that paper when you can stand behind it. Not from a cave, from a life." "I know," Wren said. She had always known. The paper was not a weapon in its current condition. A document produced by a dead girl from an underground hiding place was not a document that a judge would receive with the gravity it required. It needed a living woman standing behind it, and the living woman needed a life that the surface world could recognize and account for and assign the ordinary standing that ordinary people possessed in ordinary legal proceedings. She was building toward that. She was building toward it the way she had built the garden in the living space, in the stored provisions incrementally, and with the long patience of someone who has decided that the timeline is not hers to set and that the work is what she can control. She was still building toward it in January of 1856 when the boy followed his rabbit into the cave. She heard him before she saw him. The sound of someone moving through the eastern passage with the particular quality of motion of a person who is not aware they are being heard, the careless step and the occasional scrape of a shoulder against the passage wall that belongs to someone who believes they are alone in a space. She was in the northern alcove when she heard him checking the stores and making her regular accounting of what she had and what she needed. She set down the jar she was holding and stood very still and listened to the sound of someone entering her world from the surface. Her first instinct was to go deeper, to take the candle and move into the formation chamber and wait for the intruder to satisfy their curiosity and leave. She had done this with the one previous instance of someone approaching the eastern entrance, a child who had come no further than the first turn of the passage before retreating. She stood still and listened and assessed. The footsteps were not cautious, but they were not reckless either. They moved with the specific quality of a young person following something focused ahead rather than aware of what might be around them, the kind of attention that a hunting instinct produces when it has acquired a quarry and is following it without remainder. The footsteps stopped when they reached the main chamber. She heard the quality of the silence change, heard the particular silence that a person makes when they have entered a space that is much larger than they expected and are recalibrating everything they thought they knew about where they were. She came out of the northern alcove with the candle raised. He was standing at the edge of the ledge above the river channel, a boy, perhaps 15 or 16 years old, with a rabbit snare in one hand and an expression on his face that was cycling rapidly through several emotions, the most prominent of which were surprise and something adjacent to fear that had not yet fully decided whether it intended to become fear or something else. He was not afraid of the cave. She could see that quickly. He was surprised by the evidence of habitation by the fire pit and the pallet and the organized stores visible in the alcove entrance and the general quality of a space that had been made into something by sustained human effort. But the cave itself did not frighten him. There was something in the way he stood at the ledge looking down at the river channel below, with interest rather than alarm, that told her this was a person who had been in caves before and had found them interesting rather than threatening. "You live here," he said. It was not a question. "I live here," Ren said. His eyes moved from the cave to her face, and she watched him work through the recognition, the specific sequence of a person matching a face to a story they have been told, fitting what they are seeing to what they have heard, and arriving at a conclusion that the hearing had not prepared them for. "You're the Aldridge girl," he said. His voice had dropped. He said it the way people say things when they have just stepped into territory they had not expected to enter and are not yet sure of the rules. "But you're dead. Everyone says you drowned. Everyone Ren said is wrong." They looked at each other across the cave in the candlelight. His name was Gideon Pryor. He was 16 years old, the son of a farming family from the next valley over, which was far enough from Ren's family's valley that the story of her drowning had reached him only in its reduced form, the version that a story becomes after it has passed through enough mouths to lose the details and retain only the outline. A girl had drowned. It was sad. Life went on. He had followed a rabbit through the brush on the eastern slope of the ridge and found himself in a place that the rabbit, with whatever intelligence rabbits bring to the navigation of their environment, had apparently known about and considered a useful passage. He sat down on the limestone ledge and put the snare in his lap and looked at the cave around him with the settled attention of someone who has decided to stay. "I won't tell anyone," he said. Ren looked at him. "About why?" she said. He thought about this for a moment. Then he said, "Because you're here. Because you chose to be here. And because whatever reason you had for choosing it, it was yours to choose." She did not know what to make of that answer. She had prepared herself for negotiation for the management of a witness she would need to either trust completely or frighten adequately for some version of the conversation in which she established terms and the other person agreed to them. She had not prepared herself for an answer that was simply that, unadorned and without agenda. She made tea on the fire, and they drank it on the ledge above the river channel, and she told him enough to explain the cave without explaining everything, and he listened with the quality of someone for whom listening is a natural act rather than a task. And then he asked questions that were curious rather than interrogatory about the cave and the passage and the underground river, about the cave's temperature and the bats in the formation chamber, and whether the light from the ceiling crack was sufficient to navigate by on cloudy days. He came back the following week, and the week after. He brought things when he came. Food, primarily things that added variety to the cave's diet in ways that mattered more than they might sound to someone who has never spent a winter eating from the same set of stores without variation. Fresh eggs one week, a cut of pork another, a small wheel of hard cheese that he had wrapped in cloth and carried across the ridge inside his coat. He brought books when he could find them, a Bible with a cracked spine, a surveyor's manual that he had found in a barn and thought she might find useful for understanding the land around the cave, a volume of natural history that had belonged to his father's father and that she read 3 times in the course of that winter. He told her about the world above, not Hetty's news, which was specific and operational. Gideon's news was broader than that, the quality of a person who is naturally observant, sharing what they have observed, the texture of life in the valleys around the ridge, and the people who lived it and the events that moved through it. He told her about his family, about his parents and the farm, and the 2 older sisters who had married men from the county over. He told her about his own plans, such as they were, which were not yet plans exactly, but were the beginnings of the shape of what he wanted his life to be. He asked her one evening in March of that first winter what she intended to do. Not eventually, not someday. What she intended to do as a direction, as an orientation, as the thing that the current state of things was a passage toward, rather than a destination. She told him about the paper. Not everything, not at first, but enough. The dead instrument. Josephine's plan as she understood it. The long patience required to wait for the right circumstances to use what she had. She watched his face as she told him, and she watched him receive it with the same quality that she had noticed in him from the first evening, the quality of a person who has a straightforward relationship with the truth, who finds complexity interesting but dishonesty tiresome. "She needs you to stay dead," he said when she finished. "Yes," Wren said, "and when the time comes," he said slowly, "when your father is gone and she's taken what she wants and moved on, you come back." Wren looked at him. "With the paper," she said, "with 4 years of documented evidence that what she built was built on something false." He nodded. He looked at the fire for a moment, thinking the way he thought, which was completely and without apparent hurry. Then he looked at her. "Then you need to have someone standing beside you when you do," he said. "Someone the law can see and verify and account for. Not just a document." Wren understood what he meant. She had understood it herself in a less articulated form for most of the time she had been in the cave. That the document needed a person behind it, and the person needed a life, and a life was not something that could be built in hiding. It could be begun in hiding. It could be developed and prepared in hiding. But at the moment it needed to matter, it needed to be present in the world where mattering happened. She married Gideon Pryor in the main chamber of the cave on a morning in April of 1857. Hetty came through the eastern passage with wildflowers she had picked on the hillside above the first of the spring wildflowers, the ones that pushed through the Ozark soil before the trees had fully leafed and stood in the cold April air with the specific assertion of things that have decided winter is over, regardless of what the temperature says. The ceremony was brief. Not because what it represented was brief, but because the words required to complete a marriage, they are fewer than the words that surround them, and in the cave, with Hetty as witness and the underground river as the only music available, and the candles standing on the limestone ledge and the wildflowers in Hetty's hand, there was no need for more words than the essential ones. They said the essential ones. Hetty handed the flowers to Wren and looked at both of them for a long moment with the winter sky eyes that had been assessing things in these hills for 8 decades and had not lost their accuracy. "Stay under long enough and you forget there's sky," she said. "But you haven't forgotten." She was speaking to both of them, and to neither of them specifically, and to something else entirely. The summer of 1857 was hot in the way that Missouri summers are hot when they decide to make a point. Wren worked the expanded garden through the heat of it and put up more than she had in either of the 2 previous summers, filling the root cellar with the harvest in a systematic way that had become its own satisfaction, the satisfaction of sufficiency, of having done what was necessary well enough that necessity would not come calling in the winter. In October, Hetty came with her face arranged into the expression of someone carrying a weight they have been preparing to deliver and are not entirely ready to set down. "Silas is sick," she said. Wren sat down. He fell from the wagon in September. Broke something in his back that never healed right. He's been in bed for a month. Wren thought about her father, about the quality of his grief and the quality of his choices, and the love that had been genuine and insufficient in the simultaneous way that love is sometimes both of those things in the same person. "Josephine," Hetty said carefully. "Josephine has had papers drawn up. The same lawyer." Transferring the homestead property to Jonas in the event of your father's death. Full transfer, not use rights this time. When Wren said, "The papers are ready. They're waiting for the event they require." Wren looked at the cave wall. Then she said, "When he goes, I need to know immediately. Not the next visit, immediately." Hetty nodded. She knew what it meant. It meant the waiting had an end, now a visible end, a horizon that was approaching rather than receding, and the preparations that she had been making for 3.5 years needed to be in the state of readiness that a visible horizon required. She spent the autumn in a state of heightened attention, reviewing everything she had, making sure the document was in the condition it needed to be, in talking to Gideon about what the return would look like and what it would require and who they would need to speak to first and in what order. She was as ready as she was going to be on the 3rd day of December, 1857. Silas Aldridge fell from his horse on the icy county road north of Cedar Hollow and was dead before anyone reached him. Hetty came the next morning before the frost had left the hillside, moving through the eastern brush with an urgency she did not ordinarily carry in her body. Wren heard her coming. She was already at the passage entrance when Hetty came through, already reading the news in the quality of the old woman's movement before a word was spoken. When Wren said, "Yesterday," Hetty said, "the road north." The horse slipped. They stood in the entrance to the cave with the December air coming in from outside and the cave's constant warmth at their backs, and Wren held the information in both hands the way you hold something that is both what you expected and worse than you expected, which is a combination that grief reliably produces. She did not cry. Not then. The crying was there somewhere below the surface of things, and she was not pretending. It was not. She was simply not in the place yet where she could afford it, where the task allowed it. "How long does she stay?" Wren asked. Hetty shook her head slightly. "She's been talking about her sister in Kentucky for 2 years. My guess is spring, maybe sooner. But she'll move everything she can move first." "She'll move the transfer papers first," Gideon said. He had come through from the main chamber and was standing behind Wren in the passage. "She'll register Jonas as the owner before she goes anywhere." Hetty looked at him, then at Wren. "You have until she moves," Hetty said. "Once those papers are registered with the county, the fight is harder. Not impossible, but harder." Wren already knew this. She had known it since October, since the conversation about the papers waiting for the event they required, and she had been ready since before the no, in the way you are ready for things you have been preparing for so long that the readiness has become simply the condition you live in. Josephine remarried in February. A man from Kentucky, a widower who had come through the county on business, the kind of man who presents well in the short term and is believed on the strength of the presentation. The ceremony was small and quick. The marriage certificate was filed with the county clerk 3 days after the ceremony. The transfer papers for the Aldridge homestead were filed with the same clerk on the same day. Hetty brought this news in February's last week, standing in the cave with her coat still on, not staying, just delivering. "She's leaving in April," Hetty said. "Taking the boys, taking everything that can be moved." Wren stood in the main chamber of the cave where she had lived for 4 years and looked at the fire on the limestone ledge and the pallet and the stores and the wild flowers pressed between the pages of the surveyor's manual that Gideon had brought the first winter and that she had kept because she kept things that marked important moments. She looked at the paper in the bag at the foot of the pallet. 4 years of waiting, 4 years of preparation, 4 years of being dead to the world that had made her dead, and the moment that all of it had been aiming toward was now close enough to see clearly, close enough that the shape of it was distinct rather than theoretical. "Spring," she said. "Spring," Gideon said. She looked at him. They were going above. Judge Whitmore listened for 2 hours. He did not interrupt her. He did not ask clarifying questions during the telling. He sat across the table with his hands folded and his eyes on her face, and he received what she gave him with the specific quality of attention that a man brings to something he understands. He will not have the opportunity to hear a choice that must be received completely and correctly the first time, because the first time is the only time. She told it in the order she had prepared, the order that moved from the foundation upward from the letter, and what it proved to the pattern the ledger documented, to the sequence of events she had witnessed from the cave and had recorded with a specific precision of someone who understood from the first weeks that she was building a record for a purpose and that the record needed to be the kind that stood when examined. She told it without embellishment and without appeal to sympathy because she had spent 4 years thinking about what this moment required, and she had determined that what it required was not sentiment, but clarity, not the account of a wronged woman seeking justice, but the documented case of a fraud that had been perpetrated by a specific person using specific methods that could be traced through specific documents and confirmed through specific verification. When she finished, Whitmore was quiet for a moment. He looked at the letter, he looked at the ledger, he looked at her. Then he said, "The name Greer." "Yes," she said. He leaned back in his chair and looked at the window at the March morning outside at Cedar Hollow, going about its business in the ordinary way of a town that does not know it is in the middle of something. "There is a reason," he said slowly, "that I agreed to this meeting based on a letter from a woman I had never heard of, making claims that would have sounded in most circumstances like the claims of someone with more grievance than substance." She waited. He picked up the letter from Nashville and looked at it again, the specific look of someone confirming a detail rather than reading for the first time. "8 years ago," he said, "I handled a matter in the county to the east. A property dispute. A man had died and his widow was attempting to transfer his estate to a son who was by most accounts not the man's son at all, but the son of the widow's previous husband. The widow had been known as one thing before she arrived in that county and was discovered afterward to have been known as something else, somewhere else." Lark said nothing. "The case was resolved eventually," he said, "in favor of the legitimate heir. But the woman in that case was gone by the time the resolution came. She had left the county before the proceeding was complete and had not been located afterward." He set the letter down. "The methods you describe in your ledger," he said, "and the methods described in this letter from Nashville, and the methods employed in the matter I handled 8 years ago to the east. They have a consistent shape." "Yes," Lark said. "I believe they do." He looked at her. "I will need to verify the letter's provenance," he said, "as I said initially. I will write to the Nashville attorney whose name appears on it. I will write to the county east of here and obtain the records from the matter I handled. And I will write to Sumner County, Tennessee, to inquire about the current status of one Thomas Greer." "How long will that take?" Lark said. Whitmore considered this. "The Nashville correspondence alone is 3 weeks each way," he said, "depending on conditions. The Tennessee inquiry may take longer because locating a specific individual in a county where I have no existing relationships will require several exchanges before I reach the person who has the relevant information." "Mabel is attempting to complete the sale of the property," Lark said. "The county clerk has placed a hold on the transaction pending this proceeding. If the proceeding takes 2 months for the correspondence to complete, she is not going to complete the sale," Whitmore said. He said it with the quiet certainty of someone stating a fact that he has already decided. "The hold the clerk placed is sufficient to prevent the transaction from being recorded. Without recording, the sale has no legal standing. She can agree to a price with a buyer. She can accept payment. She can hand over a key. But without the recorded transfer, ownership does not pass, and the clerk will not remove the hold without my instruction." Lark absorbed this. Then she said, "She will leave. She will take whatever she has taken and she will go somewhere else and she will do this again." Whitmore looked at her. "That is possible," he said. "I cannot prevent a person from traveling. I can issue a warrant once the proceeding has established sufficient grounds for one, but a warrant issued in this county has limited reach. If she crosses into another state before the warrant is issued." He paused. He did not finish the sentence because the finish was obvious. "Then she will do this again," Lark said. "In another valley, with another man who has land and a daughter and grief enough to make him susceptible." She set her hands flat on the table. "She has done it before. More than once. She is good at it. She will do it again." Whitmore was quiet. She looked at him. "Is there a way," she said, "to make the reach larger than the county?" Whitmore looked at the table for a moment. "A federal matter," he said slowly, "if the fraud can be shown to have operated across state lines, across multiple jurisdictions. If the pattern can be established not as a local matter, but as a systematic practice that has moved across states and counties over time." He picked up the letter from Nashville. "Tennessee to Missouri. That is across state lines. If the matter to the east involved a county that borders another state, it is adjacent to Arkansas," Lark said. She had mapped the county to the east in her mind on many occasions over the years, had built her understanding of the regional geography as another form of preparation for what this period might require. Whitmore looked at her. Then I will include in my correspondence to the county east of here a request for information about whether the matter in that case had any cross-state dimensions, he said. And I will write not only to Nashville, but to the Federal Circuit Office. If the pattern is what we both believe it to be, the federal jurisdiction is where the appropriate reach originates. He picked up his pen. I will begin the correspondence today, he said. The proceeding is formally opened as of this morning. The property hold stands. You will be notified when the responses arrive, and we will reconvene at that point. He looked at her. You have done extraordinary work, he said, in circumstances that would have defeated most people in the first month. It was not praise in the decorative sense. It was the assessment of a professional who had processed the evidence and was reporting his finding. She received it as such. Thank you, she said. She picked up the book and stood. She walked out of the courthouse into the March morning of Cedar Hollow. The weeks that followed had the quality of a held breath. Not because nothing was happening. A great deal was happening. Most of it invisible, carried in letters moving through the postal systems of Missouri and Tennessee, and the federal circuit offices being read by people she would never meet, and answered by people whose handwriting she would see in the documents Whitmore showed her at the reconvening. What was visible was Mabel, still in the county, still in the Caldwell cabin which the property hold prevented her from transferring, and which she therefore occupied in the specific way of someone who is in a space they no longer consider theirs, but from which they have not yet departed, the way of someone whose departure has been delayed by circumstances, and who is managing that delay with the controlled patience of a person who has managed delays before. Lark went to the cabin once in those weeks, not to confront, not to discuss. She went to look at it, to stand at the gate of the yard the way she had stood at the yard gate on the morning she returned, and to let the looking do what it needed to do for a woman who had grown up in that structure and had left it under conditions that had required her to leave everything in it behind, and had spent 4 years knowing it existed on the other side of a ridge she was not yet able to cross. The oak tree at the south corner had grown another few visible inches in the weeks since she had first returned. The seasons were continuing their work on it with the patient regularity of seasons. She stood at the gate for perhaps 5 minutes. Then she went back to the Morrow farm. Mabel's buyer came to town in the third week of March. He was a man from St. Louis, a businessman with the specific manner of a city person in a rural setting, slightly overdressed and slightly too aware of the impression he was making. He came to see the property and found that the property was not available for the transaction he had been led to believe was proceeding smoothly. He spoke to the county clerk. The clerk explained with the thoroughness that was his professional characteristic that the property transfer was on hold pending a legal proceeding, and that the hold could not be lifted without the court's instruction, and that he was unable to speculate about the timeline for the proceeding's resolution. The buyer from St. Louis went back to St. Louis. This left Mabel in the county without the transaction that had been the purpose of her continued presence in it, which changed the calculation she had been working with. Lark did not know what was happening inside that calculation. She did not need to know. She needed to know what Whitmore was building with the correspondence, and she knew that when he had what he needed, he would tell her, and she knew that her work in the meantime was to be where she was and to let the proceeding proceed. She was where she was. She helped at the Morrow farm. She cooked and she mended and she planted the early spring beds with the specific competence of someone who has been keeping herself fed for 4 years through the application of horticultural skill to whatever soil was available. She slept in a bed which was different from the cave pallet in ways that she had not fully anticipated before she experienced them, primarily the ways that involved what you heard and what you did not hear, the surface world being louder than the cave in all directions, and in ways that were sometimes welcome and sometimes not. She sat in the evenings with Cade by the fire and they talked, which was also different from the cave in the specific way that talking in a house with walls between you and the world was different from talking in an underground chamber, with the river below you, the context of the conversation different, the quality of privacy different, the sense of the world outside the walls present in a way that the cave had never offered. Idelle came on a Tuesday in the second week of April. She walked the surface route, the road to the Morrow farm, and she arrived in the morning with the particular quality of motion that Lark had learned to read over the years, the quality that communicated the nature of the news before the news was delivered. She came in and sat down at the table, and Lark sat across from her. "He has written back," Idell said. "The lawyer in Nashville. Whitmore told me this morning. The letter confirms the document you have. Thomas Greer is alive." Was alive in 1851 when the letter was written, and is, according to the Nashville attorney, alive as of the date of his response to Whitmore's inquiry. "Alive," Lark said. "Alive," Idell confirmed. 61 years old, still residing in Sumner County, Tennessee. He has been, the attorney reports, the subject of ongoing inquiry by the Tennessee state authorities regarding the circumstances of his wife's departure from the county and the disposition of certain property that appears to have been transferred out of joint ownership in the months before she left. Lark held this information for a moment. "The marriage to my father," she said, "void from the beginning, from the first day," Idell said. "A married woman marrying another man. Void, not voidable, not subject to challenge, simply never having been." Which means, Lark said, which means everything she did in the name of being Fletcher Caldwell's wife, Idell said, was done by someone who had no standing to do any of it. Every paper signed, every document filed, every transfer recorded, done by a woman who was, in the eyes of the law, a stranger. Lark looked at the table. She thought about 4 years. Not the 4 years in the cave, though she thought about those too. The 4 years before the cave, the 2 years of her mother's death and her father's grief, and Mabel's installation in the household, and the progressive narrowing of Lark's space and standing within it. She thought about the morning of her birthday and the bag on the porch step and Mabel's voice saying, "My boys need the space." She thought about her father, about the man who had grieved genuinely and had not been built to resist what arrived in the shape of his relief. About the private search he had conducted, the hiring of someone to follow the river south, the months of hoping before Mabel's ultimatum closed the door on it. About the papers he had signed in the last months in the bed where the injury from the wagon had put him signing what was placed in front of him by a woman who was not his wife and had never been his wife, and whose standing to place anything in front of him at all was entirely false. She thought about the oak tree at the south corner of the yard, growing its slow annual increment regardless of what the humans around it were doing. Then she thought about what came next. What came next was the second meeting with Whitmore. It was scheduled for the following week, and it had the character that second meetings in legal proceedings have when the first meeting has established the foundation and the intervening period has produced the confirmation, the character of something moving from its preparatory phase to its active one. She went to the courthouse on the appointed morning with the bay and the letter and the ledger and the additional documents Whitmore had assembled from his correspondence, the response from Nashville, and the responses from the county to the east, and the preliminary communication from the Federal Circuit Office in St. Louis. Mabel was not at the meeting. Whitmore had sent notification to the Caldwell cabin, informing her that the proceeding was reconvening and that she had the right to be present. She had not appeared. This, Whitmore indicated, was consistent with the behavior of someone who has assessed the legal situation and determined that presence in a legal proceeding is less advantageous than absence from it. He laid out the findings from the correspondence. The Nashville attorney had confirmed the letter's provenance and the living status of Thomas Greer. The county to the east had confirmed the prior matter and had supplied the records of it, which showed the same sequence of methods employed by a woman who had operated in that county under the name of Mabel Greer before operating in this county under the name of Mabel Pruitt. The Federal Circuit Office had received Whitmore's inquiry with the specific quality of interest that indicated the information was not new to them and was being received as confirmation of something they had been developing independently. The federal office, Whitmore said, has been conducting an inquiry of its own into property fraud operating across state lines in Arkansas, Missouri, and Tennessee. They have identified a pattern. They have been working to identify a specific individual as the source of that pattern. He looked at her. The description of the individual matches what we know of Mabel Pruitt Greer in every specific particular. Lark said nothing. The federal inquiry is not something I can affect. Whitmore continued. It operates on its own timeline and through its own processes. What I can tell you is that the federal agents who contacted this office in response to my inquiry have indicated that the information I have provided, combined with the documentation you brought to this proceeding, represents the most complete account of this individual's methods that they have assembled from any single case. She looked at him. Can they reach her, she said. If she is in a state that falls within federal jurisdiction, he said carefully, and if the warrant they intend to seek is issued, then yes. The reach is larger than this county and larger than this state, he paused. But she has to be found, he said, and she may not be found. People who have been doing what she has been doing for as long as she appears to have been doing it tend to understand how to be difficult to find when the circumstances require it. Lark looked at the table. I know, she said. She did know. She had prepared for this possibility over the years, had worked through the version of the resolution that ended with Mabel beyond reach, and had thought about what she was able to accept in that version and what she was not, and had arrived at an understanding of what justice actually meant in the practical sense, as opposed to the abstract sense, which was an understanding that included the acceptance of incompleteness. Mabel might not be found. Mabel might spend the rest of her life moving through the country's valleys with a new name and a new story, and the accumulated practice of someone who had been doing this long enough to have refined every aspect of it into something very difficult to interrupt. This was possible. This was a reality she had to hold alongside the other reality, the reality of the proceeding and its findings and what those findings would produce. What do you need from me today, she said. Whitmore laid out what he needed, which was her testimony given formally in the proceeding on record, the testimony that established her living presence and her status as Fletcher Caldwell's legal heir, and her account of the events from the morning of her birthday forward. He needed it in the form that a formal proceeding required, which was different from the account she had given him in the first meeting, in the sense that it had a different destination, would become part of the permanent record of the proceeding, and could therefore be examined and contested and appealed. She gave it. She gave it with the same quality she had given everything in the years leading up to this, the quality of someone for whom the work is the work and the manner of doing it is as important as the outcome, because the outcome depends entirely on the work having been done correctly. She spoke for 3 hours. At the end of it, Whitmore signed the findings. The property transfer filed by Mabel Pruitt Caldwell to Reuben Pruitt was voided. The basis for the voiding was stated clearly in the document. The individual filing the transfer had not been legally married to the property owner, had no standing as the owner's heir or widow, had obtained the transfer through misrepresentation of her legal status, and had therefore had no authority to initiate or complete any transaction involving the estate. The property, all of it, the homestead and the land, and the contents of the root cellar, and the tools in the barn, and the oak tree at the south corner of the yard, was recognized as the rightful inheritance of Lark Caldwell Morrow, living heir to Fletcher Caldwell, who had been alive at the time of her father's death, and whose standing had been obscured by the fraudulent actions of a third party. A warrant was issued for the arrest of Mabel Pruitt Greer on charges of fraud, bigamy, and obtaining property by deception. It was copied to the Federal Circuit Office. She folded the document Whitmore handed her. She put it in the bag. She walked out of the courthouse into the April morning. The air was different from the March morning of her return. April in the Ozarks had reached the commitment that March was still considering, the trees fully leafed, now the valley green in the sustained and confident way of a season that has established itself. The river visible at the south end of the main street was running at spring levels fuller than it had been in March, carrying the snowmelt from the upper hills down through the valley in the bright, purposeful way of spring water that has accumulated all winter and is finally going somewhere. Cade was waiting at the edge of the street. She showed him the document. He read it. He handed it back. They walked north together out of town along the county road that ran up the valley toward the Caldwell property. They walked past the bend where the path to Idell's cabin turned off past the river marker she had seen on the morning of her return, the small painted post that said, "In memory of Lark Caldwell." She stopped at it. She stood at the bank where her footprints had walked into the water in January of 1854, the bank she had stood at before the first step and the first breath, and the plunge into the dark passage that had taken her through to the other side. She looked at the marker. Then she looked at the river. It was the same river. It had been the same river on the morning she walked into it, and it was the same river now, indifferent to whether she had lived or died or come back again, occupied entirely with its own business of moving from the hills to the valley in the persistent and uninterested way of water that has a direction and follows it without requiring permission or witness. She thought about what the river had been to her and what it had done and what it had given, which was not what the marker said. The marker said it had taken her, The marker was wrong, had always been wrong, had been wrong from the first morning when the footprints in the sow were not what they appeared to be, and the river was not doing what anyone standing at the bank that morning had believed it was doing. She had walked into it, and it had taken her through. Not taken. Carried. There was a difference, Doink. She stood at the bank for a moment longer. Then she and Cade walked the remaining distance to the Caldwell property. The cabin was empty, not empty in the sense of containing nothing. The furniture was still there, most of it the pieces that were too heavy or too inconvenient to have been loaded onto a wagon by a woman who had left without the full preparation she had intended, who had departed in the specific way of someone accelerating a timeline, because the timeline had been altered by circumstances she had not anticipated. The kitchen things were largely intact. The bedroom had been stripped of certain items, but the bed frame remained, and the wardrobe and the shelf on the wall where her mother's hairbrush had once sat, and where Lark now placed it again, setting it in the place it had always been, with the specific deliberateness of a person returning a thing to the position it should never have left. The good dishes were gone. The box had been loaded onto whatever wagon Mabel had used for her departure. Other things were gone too. Things she could inventory later and come to terms with later, things that were replaceable or acceptable as losses given the full accounting of what had been kept and what had been recovered. She stood in the main room of the cabin for a long time. She stood in the room that had been her mother's kitchen and her father's house and the space where 17 years of her life had taken place. And she let it be what it was, which was a room that contained the past. The way rooms contain the past, not as a living presence, but as a quality of the air and the light and the particular way the floor creaked when you crossed the threshold. All the accumulated sensation of the years in which a place has been inhabited by specific people who are now gone. She was not gone. She had come back. She went to the window and looked out at the yard, at the oak tree, at the south corner, at the field beyond it where the spring grass was coming in bright, and even at the ridge to the east where the slope rose toward the cave that she had called home for 4 years. The hill sitting above the valley with its face turned south in the way it had always faced, indifferent to everything the valley did and did not do. She could not see the eastern entrance from here. She could see the shape of the ridge, and she knew where the entrance was. Within that shape knew it, in way she knew every particular of the system she had spent 4 years learning, and she let herself look at the ridge and let the knowing be present without turning it into something it was not. The cave was the cave. It was still there at 55 degrees, the underground river running through it with its constant warmth, the formation chamber building its columns at their imperceptible annual rate, the northern alcoves dry and available, the ceiling crack letting in the light at its perpetual angle. It would be there when she needed it, and when her children needed it, and when the world offered the specific kind of difficulty that required a person to know they had a place the world could not reach. But she was not there now. She was here. They moved to the Caldwell property in May. Cade's parents helped with the practical work of it, the moving of what needed to be moved, and the repair of what the months of Mabel's occupancy had let go, and the preparation of the garden beds for the late spring planting that would feed them through the coming year. She planted the garden with the competence of someone who has been keeping a garden under considerably more difficult conditions and who found the Caldwell soil, which her family had been improving for 3 generations, extraordinarily generous by comparison. The first summer was the summer of rebuilding, not only the physical rebuilding, the repair of the porch boards and the patching of the roof and the replacement of the fence rails that had deteriorated in the months of insufficient attention, though that work was real and required sustained effort across the warm months. The rebuilding of the other kind, the kind that does not have visible components and does not proceed in a linear way from damaged to repaired, but rather moves through its own irregular process, appearing complete in some moments and incomplete in others, requiring a different kind of patience than the physical work required. She did not rush it. She had learned in 4 years of underground living that patience was not the absence of desire for things to be otherwise, but the presence of sufficient understanding of how things worked to let them proceed at the rate they actually proceeded, rather than the rate you wished they would proceed. She had learned this in the cave, and she brought it out of the cave with her, and it served her in the summer of the return the way it had served her in the years that preceded it. Idelle came in July with her cat and a jar of something she had put up the previous autumn, and the specific quality of presents that she always brought, the presence of someone who had been around a very long time and had learned to bring only what was useful. They sat on the Caldwell porch in the July afternoon and drank the tea Lark made and looked at the valley and the ridge and the river at the valley's southern edge in the hills beyond. She will not be found, Idell said. She did not say it with regret or with satisfaction, simply with the assessment of someone who had been watching the world long enough to have a reliable sense of how such things resolved. I know, Lark said. She had received word from Whitmore 3 weeks before. The warrant had been issued and circulated. The federal inquiry had been formalized. The agents were pursuing the matter with what their communications described as active attention. But Mabel had not been located. She had left the county before the warrant was issued and had left no clear direction. The correspondence with Tennessee had confirmed that Thomas Greer was alive and that Mabel Greer was the subject of inquiry there also, which provided additional jurisdictions and additional motivation to find her. But finding a person who has spent decades learning how not to be found is not a straightforward matter, regardless of how many jurisdictions are looking. She may do it again, Lark said. In another valley? Idell looked at the ridge. Perhaps, she said. Or perhaps she is too old for it, now too tired of the building and the maintaining of the pretense. She paused. People reach a point sometimes where the effort exceeds what they are able to spend on it. Lark thought about this. I hope she does not do it again, she said. I hope the warrant reaches her wherever she has gone and the people whose job it is to enforce it do their job. But I cannot make that happen, and I have spent enough of the last 4 years living in conditions not of my choosing to know the difference between what I can affect and what I cannot. Idell looked at her with those eyes. That is wisdom, she said. Lark thought about the cave, about the constant temperature in the formation chamber, in the northern alcoves, in the eastern entrance in the hillside brush, about the underground river that had carried her through in January of 1854, and that was running through the hill at this same moment, while she sat on this porch in the July afternoon, running through the dark at 55 degrees, exactly as it had run before her and would run after her. I did not find the wisdom in a comfortable place, she said. No, Idell said, the comfortable places do not produce it. They sat in the afternoon quiet of the porch, and the July moved around them in its warm, unhurried way, the long Ozark summer afternoon that had been part of the texture of her life since she could remember it, since she was small enough that her feet did not reach the floor when she sat in the porch chair, and her mother hummed something in the kitchen behind the open door. She was home, not in the simple sense of having returned to a familiar structure. In the complete sense, the sense that includes not only the structure but the self that inhabits it, the recognition that the self inhabiting it has been shaped specifically by the passage it has taken, and that the self sitting on this porch in July is not the girl who left it in January 4 years ago, and is better suited to what the home requires than that girl would have been. The home requires someone who can work it and hold it and pass it on. She was that person. In October, Whitmore sent word that the response from the Federal Circuit Office had arrived. The agents had traced Mabel Pruitt Greer as far as a town in Arkansas, where she had spent several weeks in the early summer, where local inquiry had confirmed a woman matching her description had been asking questions about available properties and widowed landowners in the surrounding county. She had been gone from that location before the agents arrived. A lead in Indian Territory had not been confirmed. The inquiry was ongoing. It would remain ongoing. The warrant did not expire. Whitmore added a note in his own hand at the bottom of the official communication. It said, "The work you brought to this office was the most complete and well-documented account of this kind of fraud I have handled in 20 years. Whatever else the outcome may be, you have established the record of what she did here in a form that cannot be undone. That is not nothing." She folded the letter and put it in the box where she kept the documents. The box also contained the Nashville letter and the ledger and the property judgment and a copy of the warrant and the deed to the Caldwell homestead in her name, all of it together in the organized way of documents that belong to the same story and should be kept in the same place. She put the box on the shelf in the main room, the shelf where her mother's dishes had once been, and where Mabel's box of dishes had once been the shelf that had been the repository of the household's important things for as long as the household had existed. She looked at it for a moment. Then she went back to the work of the afternoon. The first child was born in the spring of 1860, a girl arriving with the specific announcement of a person who has decided she is ready and is not interested in delay. She was small and loud and had a quality of presence disproportionate to her dimensions, the quality of someone who intends to occupy the space available to them completely and has begun this practice from the first moments. They named her Willa. The second child was a boy born 2 years later in the summer. He arrived in the easy way of second children who have benefited from their parents' practice with the first, and he had his father's quality of stillness and his mother's quality of paying attention to things without appearing to pay attention to them. They named him Fletcher. She sat with the baby in the main room on the evening after the naming, in the chair by the fireplace, the same chair where she had sat 17 years before in the first days of Mabel's arrival, and had tried to understand what was changing and what she could do about what was changing. The chair had not moved from that position in all the years between. The fireplace was the same fireplace. The room was the same room. She was not the same person. She said the name aloud, Fletcher, and the room received it the way rooms receive names spoken in them, without comment, with the simple presence of walls that have heard a great deal and keep it all. She thought about her father, about the quality of his love for her, which had been real and consistent through her childhood, and had not failed to exist even when it had failed to be sufficient, when the circumstances had required more of it than the man possessed, and he had given what he had, and it had not covered the need. She thought about the private search, the months of hoping before the door was closed on it, and she thought about what it had cost him to close that door, and how she understood the cost now in a way she had not been able to understand it at 17. She forgave him in the way that forgiveness actually happens, which is not in a single moment of decision, but in the accumulation of understanding that makes holding a thing against someone more effort than it is worth, in the slow process of comprehending a person fully enough that their failures become part of the whole picture rather than the central feature of it. She had forgiven him. She named his grandson after him so that the name continued. The third child was a girl they named Clara, for Lark's mother, the first, Clara having been the person whose death had set everything in motion and whose absence had made the household susceptible to what arrived in that absence. The naming was not a memorial. It was an inheritance, the passing of a name forward in the way that families pass names forward, as an act of continuation rather than commemoration. The fourth child was a boy they named Cain, which was Cade's grandfather's name, and which had been offered and accepted in the way of names that carry the specific weight of the person who bore them first. The fifth was a girl. She was born in a cold November, the last child arriving with the deliberate quality of someone who has timed their arrival precisely and intends the timing to mean something. She was small and had gray eyes that opened in the first days and looked at the world with the specific quality of someone who has already been paying attention and is now simply confirming what they have been attending to. They named her Idelle. She sat on the Caldwell porch in the December afternoon with the baby in her arms and looked at the ridge to the east, at the slope where the cave entrance was hidden in the overgrown brush of the hillside, and she thought about the woman at the river bend who had opened her door before Lark reached it and had offered warmth and tea and the knowledge of a country that had been essential. "I will tell you about her," she said to the baby, "when you are old enough to understand it. About where you come from in the winter of 1854 and the underground river that ran through the dark at 55 degrees and kept me warm when the surface world had decided it was done with me." The baby looked at the afternoon. "I will tell you all of it," Lark said. "Every part." The children learned the cave when each was old enough. Not all at the same age, because they were not the same people and did not become ready at the same time. Willa was the first at 10 years old, making the passage through the eastern entrance on her own, in the way of a person who has heard about something for years and is finally meeting it for herself, the reality and the account of it coming together in the specific satisfaction of a thing confirmed. She stood in the formation chamber with her candle raised and turned slowly the way her mother had turned on the first exploration, her face going through the sequence that her mother recognized from her own experience of that chamber, the understanding arriving that the world contained things of this quality, in the dark below its surface had always contained them, had been containing them since before the concept of containing was available to anyone. Lark watched her from the entrance to the chamber. She did not say anything. There was nothing to say that the chamber was not saying more completely. She told them the full story when they were old enough. not the simplified version that children sometimes receive when the full version is considered too heavy for them. The full version with all its weight and all its specific costs because they deserve to know it completely, and because the land they were living on was land that had been fought for, and the biting was the reason they had it, and knowing the reason was part of having the thing correctly. She told it because the telling was a form of preparation, because the questions the world asked of people did not diminish and did not become easier. And knowing that someone before you had been asked hard questions and had found answers was useful in the specific way of being useful when the time came, which was to say, useful in the only sense that mattered. The years passed with the unhurried pace of years in which the main work is the ongoing work of keeping something alive and growing it and maintaining it against the weather and the time and all the other conditions that test whether the thing you have built is built well enough to last. Whitmore died in 1871. He died having issued the warrant that had not resulted in an arrest that was still technically outstanding because warrants issued in formal proceedings of that kind did not expire and remained on the books until they were resolved one way or another. The federal inquiry had gone quiet after the first 2 years had not been formally closed, but had ceased to produce active results. Mabel Pruitt Greer had not been found. Lark thought about this occasionally in the way you think about incomplete things, the way certain stories exist in your life without ending in the way that stories are supposed to end, with the resolution that confirms the meaning and closes the account. The story of Mabel was an incomplete story, and it would remain incomplete, and she had come to terms with the incompleteness in the specific way that she had come to terms with other things the world had offered her that were not what she had wished for. She had wished for the warrant to reach Mabel. She had wished for the accounting to be complete. She had not received the complete accounting, and she had accepted this without allowing it to become the defining fact of what the years had been, without letting the incompleteness of one part of the story obscure the completeness of the whole of it, which was considerable and which did not require Mabel's arrest to be what it was. She was still alive, still on the land that was hers, still raising the children who would carry forward what she had built, who would know where they came from and what it had pieced and what the cave and the underground river in the January morning of 1854 had been in the larger story of what the Caldwell land was and how it had come to the people who held it. Idell died in 1874. She died at the River Bend cabin in the late winter in the chair by the fire, in the way of someone who has been where they belong for their entire life and has not needed to go anywhere else and is ending in the place they have always been, attended by the sounds of the river outside and the hills around her and the accumulated warmth of a fire that had been burning in that chimney for longer than anyone's accurate memory extended. Lark was with her. She had gone when Kate brought word that Idell was failing, had walked the path to the river bend in the February cold, and had sat with the old woman through the last 2 days the way you sit with someone who has been essential to you when the time for sitting with them has come. Idell's last words were simple. "You were always going to make it through that passage," she said. "I just showed you it was there." "That is enough," Lark said. "That was everything." The fire kept the cabin warm in the way it always had. Outside the river ran in its February channel the same river, the river that had received her footprints in January of 1854 and had given her passage through the underground to the other side. Still running, still indifferent, still carrying everything it received from the hills above down through the valley and away. She sat with Idell through the last hour. Then she walked back to the Caldwell property through the February morning, through the bare trees and the cold that was already inclining toward spring, the thaw visible in the quality of the air, and the sound of water beginning to move in places where it had been frozen. The season doing what it always did, what it had always done, proceeding from one condition to the next with the patient inevitability of things that do not require our observation or participation. She lived to 1912, 75 years of it, every one of them, including the 4 in the cave, and the ones before them, and the ones after, used completely. Nothing wasted, everything that was given her received and worked with and made into something further. They buried her on the ridge above the cave. The grave faced east, the direction from which she had emerged on the March morning of 1858, the direction of the eastern entrance, in the path down the hillside to the Caldwell property, and the road into Cedar Hollow, and everything that had followed from the emergence. Below the grave on the hillside, the eastern entrance to the cave was still there. Overgrown now with decades of unmanaged brush, harder to find than it had been in 1854, requiring knowledge of where to look and what to look for. The five children knew. The grandchildren knew. The knowledge passed forward, the way the name had passed forward, as inheritance, as the specific wealth of knowing where you come from and what the ground beneath you contains. The stone was simple as she had asked for it to be simple, carrying only what needed to be said and nothing additional. The children had argued briefly about the words in the way that families argue about such things when they love the person they are commemorating and want the words to be adequate. They arrived at what she would have chosen, which was what she had always said when people asked her about the river, when people who had heard the story or part of the story asked her how she had survived it and what it had given her. The river didn't take her, the stone said. It saved her. The cave is still there. The system extends through the limestone hill on the east side of the valley, the same way it has always extended at the same temperature, with the underground river running through it in the same darkness it has always run through, indifferent to the passage of the seasons above it, and the passage of the years, and the passage of the people who have known about it, and kept that knowing within themselves and passed it forward. The eastern entrance is harder to find than it was, but it is there, and the main chamber with the ceiling crack still lets in the light at its characteristic angle when the sky outside is clear, the light falling across the water in the channel below the western ledge and illuminating the formation chamber entrance on the far side. The same light that fell in the same way on the January morning of 1854 when a 17-year-old girl pulled herself gasping onto the limestone shelf and looked up at the crack in the ceiling and understood that she had come through. She had come through. That is what the cave still says in the language of temperature and stillness and the sound of water moving in the dark. That passage was always there. The world was full of passages in the limestone and in the human spirit carved by the slow, patient work of what moved through them, available to anyone who knew they were there and was willing to go through them in the dark. You just had to be willing to go in.